Rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the
United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, everyone. We're down here this evening because the majority of our meeting will be in a workshop format. But before we begin, we have a little bit of business to do. Is there any public comment from the board? I'm sorry, let me first announce that in accordance with requirements of the open meeting law, please be advised that this meeting is being recorded and broadcast over the Lunenburg Public Access Channel. Any public comment from the board?
I actually just wanted to mention that since this is our last meeting in October, I wanted to remind everyone that the next pancake breakfast is going to be the first Wednesday of the month, which is unheard of, I know, but the Lions Club has to get ready for the Thanksgiving baskets that they assemble, and Thanksgiving's early this year, so they couldn't do a pancake breakfast and get everything ready for Thanksgiving in the same week. So it's going to be the first week. We've had signs up the last couple of months, so hopefully we'll all remember. Thank you.
Any public comment from the public? Seeing none, we can begin. Our first item of business is to deal with the resignation from the Cultural Council. Is there a letter in here?
Yes, titled Resignation, Cultural Council.
Okay. Give me a second. Okay. It's good evening. After plenty of thought on the matter, I find it easier on my mental health to resign from the Cultural Council. This is my resignation letter. I'm sure I will find reasons to sit on another board in town or be involved with other things, but for now I just need to step away. Thanks. And it's signed Christopher Letarte and dated October 7th, 2018. So we will accept that resignation, I guess. And we have 3 appointments on the agenda to the Cultural Council. One for Tyler Hathaway. We'll take them one at a time, I guess. The final one, the Darren Massey one, has been withdrawn. I will read that note. Okay. This is to our executive administrator from Darren Massey. It says, Elaine, I reviewed the terms of the Massachusetts Cultural Council grants. The MCC gives examples of possible conflict of interest situations in potentially being on a commission and applying for grants. The possibility for conflict of interest being present or absent is dependent on various factors regarding applying for a grant. I do not have the information I need to evaluate if my application may potentially lead to a situation of a conflict of interest. I would like to request your withdrawing my application for consideration to the Cultural Commission at this time. Please remove my appearance at the BOS meeting tonight due to the above. Thank you, Darren Massey, dated October 16th. So the 2 that we do have, and there are talent bank forms in your packet, is the first one is Tyler Hathaway. How are you? Can I ask you to come up here for us, please? Thank you. Maybe you could take a minute and tell us who you are and why you want to be on the Cultural Council.
Sure. I actually moved to Lunenburg about 1.5 years ago. I grew up in Ashburnham. My wife grew up in Westminster. We've been living in Boston up until moving back. I'm a digital product designer, mostly like websites and stuff like that, or apps and that sort of thing. I'm also an illustrator, so I've worked a lot in marketplaces that are pop-ups, stuff like that. And I've been a kid wandering through museum hallways for a long time because my mom worked at Decordova, Fitchburg Art Museum, that sort of stuff. So yeah, I felt like this was a good way for me to get involved in the town.
Great, thank you. So any questions or comments from the board?
I would make a motion, we appoint Tyler Hathaway to the Cultural Council with a term ending June 30th, 2021.
Second.
Is there a second? Yes, thank you. Any discussion?
Do we have two applicants or two positions, or?
We have several positions.
Okay.
So we're trying to fill 2, but there are still several remaining.
Sounds good.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Great, congratulations, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You'll need to see the town clerk and get sworn in, and then you're on your way. And the other application is from a Jamie Merrill Blood. Thank you.
Hello.
I like your name.
Oh, thank you. My name's Jamie Merrill Blood. I am a resident of Lunenburg. I moved to Lunenburg about 6 years ago. My husband is a lifelong resident. And so when I attended Stillman's Fair, I had filled out a talent form and was asked to consider joining this commission. I believe that the arts are an extremely important fabric of our society, and they add a lot of value. So that is why I'm interested.
Thank you. Any questions or comments from the board?
I would make a motion, we appoint Jamie Merrill Blood to the Cultural Council with a term to expire June 30th, 2021.
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
very
you
much.
very much.
Our next item of business is the town manager report.
An update on the Summer Street project. The contractor has reclaimed the roadway from Rocky's Hardware in Fitchburg to the Baker's Brook Bridge. Emulsion injection of the reclaimed material is scheduled for October 12th and 13th. Paving of the base and intermediate courses in this area is scheduled for the week of October 15th. The drainage trunk line has been completely installed in Lunenburg. Installation of the trunk line is progressing in Leominster, but was slowed last week when ledge was encountered. The hope is to complete the drainage main in Leominster by October 19th. The contractor will then begin tying catch basins into the new drainage main, starting at the Baker's Brook Bridge in Lunenburg and progressing towards Leominster. Additionally, after paving, it is anticipated that the curb and sidewalk work will begin in Fitchburg, starting at the John Fitch Highway intersection and progressing towards Lunenburg. This work is subject to the availability of curb sidewalk subcontractor. Given the condition of the existing pavement on North Street in Leominster, Mass DOT has decided to do some patch paving prior to winter to alleviate further deterioration of the road this winter. Mass DOT has also decided to reclaim the North Street portion of the project instead of milling. Reclaim of Lunenburg and Leominster will be done in the spring and summer of 2019. Update on the Town Hall weather vane. The Historical Commission provided us with an estimated replacement cost, and once we receive a formal quote from the vendor, we can submit the property claim with our insurance company. Beyond the actual replacement of the weather vane, the DPW director has cautioned that the structural integrity of the clock tower and mount that the weather vane would be installed on need considerable work. This would need to be reviewed and may be a capital project request in the fiscal 20 through 24 capital plan. The next Business Town Partnership meeting will be Thursday, October 25th at 5 p.m. in the second floor meeting room of Town Hall, and we will be reviewing a draft of the business brochure. Town Council office hours will be Tuesday, November 27th, 12 to 4 p.m., Monday, December 17th, 8 a.m. to 12 p.m. An announcement about municipal aggregation electricity rates. The new rates for residents that are municipal aggregation customers with Constellation New Energy will be 10.998 cents per kilowatt hour, starting on their November meter read date. Our municipal aggregation consultant, Colonial Power, procured this rate from Constellation after going out for competitive bids. This rate will be fixed for the next 36 months. And also noteworthy, as of December 1st, 2018, Unitil's electric winter service fixed residential rates will rise to 12.915 cents per kilowatt hour. Residents can opt in or out of the aggregation program at any point. So this includes if during the year the rates they see Unitil's rates are lower, you can opt out of the program at that time, or opt in when Unitil's rates are higher. We will post a public notice on the town website with the new rates under this program that includes the contact information to opt in or out of the program. I will be attending a...
Quick question on that.
Sure.
If you don't take any action, you stay where you are?
Yes.
So
If
if
you're
you're
in the
in, you're in.
program.
If you're out, you stay out?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I'll be attending a community access monitor training through the Massachusetts Office on Disability tomorrow and Thursday. This training is to better understand the town's obligations to provide access to the disability community. Some vacancies for paid positions: the town mechanic position, assistant town mechanic position, and the heavy equipment operator labor are currently still open. And there are still vacancies on the Agricultural Commission, Architectural Preservation District Commission, Cultural Council, Public Access Committee, and Zoning Board of Appeals. That's all I have for tonight.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? All right. We have no minutes. We do have some warrants. An accounts payable warrant in the amount of $329,577.20.
Can I ask the town manager one quick question on the report? Did the emulsion injection take place?
I haven't received an update from Mass DOT since this last one, so I can inquire about that.
It was
Yeah.
supposed to be just done, and there was weather conditions were...
Well, yeah, it's been very rainy.
Right.
I can check on that.
Thanks.
Accounts payable warrant in the amount of $161,511.81. And a payroll warrant in the amount of $779,721.38. Are there any action file issues? Any committee reports?
Yes. The Stormwater Task Force will meet on the 25th. The school committee meeting will be held at the middle high school tomorrow night and will be taped for broadcast at a later date, not live, and will include update on the school's MCAS scores. I am going to attend the Selectmen's Meeting on Saturday morning from 8 to 2. It's going to be right down the road at Devon, so I thought it would be a good opportunity. The conference will break into two tracks, one with workshops for smaller and rural communities, and one with workshops geared toward larger towns. So hopefully there'll be lots of information I can bring back.
For capital planning, just want to point out our schedule moving forward for presentations from department heads. November 6th, we have the school and IT departments. November 20th, we have the police and fire departments. And November 27th, we have the DPW director. If anyone's interested in seeing what the capital requests are.
Now, those agendas must be posted, right?
We haven't posted the agenda that far out, no.
Okay, so how will we know when the meetings are?
Because I just told you. I can, I suppose we can put some placeholder agendas on there, and update them if we have other business to put on there, I guess, if you want.
Yeah, because that way it would be nice for people to be able to see.
They're all Tuesdays,
coming
right?
in.
All Tuesdays at 5 here.
Tuesdays at 5, okay.
So then the next consecutive Tuesdays, or no, it doesn't start till 11/6?
11/6, and it's every Tuesday except for town meeting Tuesday, so, in November.
Okay, thanks. I'd like to see that up on the website. That'd be great.
I'll be attending MPO tomorrow, representing Subregion 3. That's at 1 o'clock. Okay. Old business, we have the Board of Selectmen goals on our list. I don't believe we have any discussion for that tonight. We may cycle back as a result of some other discussions. We do have a discussion about the special town meeting warrant articles. Right?
Yes. So in your packet is a final draft, final version of the town meeting warrant for your signature tonight. And if there's any follow-up questions after the public hearing we had the other night, please let me know. The one article regarding the Americans with Disabilities Committee, I did put in your folder a draft for revisions to that bylaw, and that is Article 10. So it just expands the definition of term of appointments, voting power, resignation, how vacancies are handled, provides new sections on meetings, office, and selection of officers. And I tried to mirror what was in for bylaws for other committees such as PAC and Agricultural Commission. Those are in our bylaws for how officers are appointed or meetings are established. And it gives a good definition. We've talked a lot about how to onboard committees members, and I think having certain definitions outlined in the bylaw will be very helpful as they come on board. And it also allows for the board to establish a charge to outline the additional duties of the committee.
If I'm not, we don't have this committee currently, is that correct?
It's defunct right now. There is a bylaw. I don't think it's, there have been no members on that committee for quite some time.
I think it was originally established in order to apply for a grant.
Okay. So if this warrant article is approved at town meeting, we can begin to staff it up when? Right after town meeting, or do we have to wait some
Right after
period of
it's,
time?
yep, right after.
Right after, okay.
And then if we have a difficulty staffing it, finding people with disabilities or family members to want to volunteer, I guess the only mechanism to modify it would be at the next town meeting to change the composition again.
Yes, I've already had one person come forward
Oh, good.
seeking
Good.
appointment.
Great.
Good.
Do you already have the warrant all ready for us to sign tonight anyways?
Yes.
Okay, so I, based on this, I'm prepared to recommend approval, but it won't, at town meeting, but it won't be changing on the warrant.
Right.
So do you want to wait till town meeting to make that?
Yeah, I mean.
Yeah, okay, because it's not going to be printed, right? Okay.
This will be filed with the town clerk and in our office I put the date of October 22nd on the warrant, just so if there were any comments or revisions, we had time between now and the 22nd, I can incorporate those.
Oh, so it could list that we recommend approval?
No, not
No?
the approval, that's already printed on the warrant.
Okay, fair enough.
Or waiting till town meeting, the actual text that we're gonna recommend for adoption.
Okay. So do you need a motion of any sort on this one article, or is this just for our information?
I don't unless you're gonna recommend any changes.
No.
Okay. Any other discussion or recommendations, or? All right.
I had a question on Article 7.
Salary administration bylaw?
Yeah, I'm just wondering exactly what has changed. Is it just that 10 months?
That is also within your drive. It's the document titled Tracked SAP with Proposed Revisions.
That's what I'm looking at.
Okay, so the vacation section, how that's the accrual of vacation time, it mirrors another contract. And also amends the provision about carryover of excess time. Right now, it's only that time, if they have left on the books, be paid out. And it also changes the payout from the last warrant in June to the first one in July. That's a timing with the payroll warrant. The last payroll warrant of the fiscal year occurs in the first warrant in July. It also changes the family and medical leave section to mirror the town's policy, and a definition of hourly employee, striking that hourly employees are not eligible for benefits, which is not always the case.
So the new definition of our employee doesn't take a position on whether they're eligible for benefits or not, because that depends on other things.
Right.
Okay. Did that answer your question, Mrs. Luck?
Yep. So the, basically the hours of paid vacation, nothing in that changed. It's really just sort of cleaning up
Yeah, the language.
language. Okay, thank you.
And we don't plan on going through either the noise bylaw or the zoning usage table tonight. We're gonna go through that at town meeting, is that the plan?
Right,
Is that
there have
the
been no
plan?
changes since the public hearing on those two. Those will be also filed at the town clerk and Board of Selectmen's office and planning board for the planning board article.
And they're going to be on the website as well.
They will be on the website as well.
Great.
So I'd make a motion, we sign the warrant.
Second.
Any discussion?
Sure, sorry.
Sure.
I just wanted to ask, while we have town council here, if there's any input on the Article 18, the land conveyance, and the fact that we may not own that piece of land, and just being prepared to answer questions related to that.
Sure, through you, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
So the challenge with 18, much like 17, is that they're both citizens petitions. So the rule is when the selectmen receive a citizen's petition, it needs to be printed in the warrant verbatim the way that it's received. What that sometimes means, what it often means, is that I get questioned either prior to or at town meeting relative to what effect a warrant article may have if in fact it's voted. Sometimes it doesn't have the intended effect because it hasn't gone through the review by those who are familiar with town meeting procedure or a legal review by town council like the other articles in the warrant do. So I have reviewed Article 18. Generally, it's in the appropriate form, but you raise a good point, which is obviously the town can't convey something that it doesn't own. I don't have any information one way or the other relative to this particular property. I have discussed with Heather that issue. She made me aware of it. Generally, when the town conveys property, much like when it acquires property, our recommendation as council is that there be certain check boxes that are satisfied, and we have a list that we go through. Heather and I have done it once or twice before, where we start with something like a title examination. We proceed to something like a survey. If it's a property that the town is acquiring, we might recommend environmental assessment to be sure that you know what you're getting. So in an instance like this, there's really no risk to the town if the town were to convey a property that it doesn't own and receive consideration for it, and then an individual private property owner acquires it and then finds out years later that the town had no authority to sell it because it didn't own that property. Well, then that property owner has paid valuable consideration for something it didn't receive. The burden is always on the buyer beware, to complete a title examination. I would recommend, it's obviously not the town's intention to sell something it doesn't own, that we would coordinate that with the buyer. We would have the buyer complete a title examination to verify that indeed the town does own it, and then we could rely upon that title examination for purposes of the conveyance. There's often inconsistencies as well, and this is something I discussed with Heather today, between title records and assessor's records. So what the assessor's records show in terms of the map itself or the reference within the assessor's records to a book and page at the Registry of Deeds often doesn't match up with the result of a title examination, because there are from time to time inconsistencies. Assessor's records are not always completely accurate. Through no fault of the assessor, it's just how it happens. There's no requirement that when property is divided or subdivided or conveyed that the details of the title examination or the plans of record be transmitted to the assessor's office so that the records can be updated. So I would recommend that process be followed. Obviously, all that Article 18 would do, if in fact it's voted, all that it would accomplish is to grant the authority to the selectmen to convey the property on the terms and conditions it deems appropriate, and certainly those terms and conditions could be, at a minimum, that there be a valid title examination completed by the buyer to verify that you've got good title.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question? Any other discussion? All those in favor of signing?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Alrighty, so I'm going to give you a minute to do that, and then I think we move into the workshop portion of our meeting, which is to go through each of the selectmen regulations and policies and vote on either a new policy in one case or a revision of other policies. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And the first one is the special event permit policy.
This one labeled Special Event Draft 4.
Okay. Now, do you have a suggestion on how we best do this?
So I would.
Obviously, you got a plan.
Well, I figured I'd come over here since there's a microphone. I don't know if it needs to be that close, though.
So this was discussed at a previous meeting.
Right.
And this is a follow-up conversation and regarding some provisions of what the land use director had provided at that meeting, as well as incorporating text that town council had provided as well. So I think Adam Burney can explain that.
Take it away, Adam.
All right, so, wow. We've talked about this several times before, and you actually have two new drafts, because after talking with Attorney Costa today, I made some revisions to the opening section that talks about what a special event is. So I'll refer both to my document and to Attorney Costa's document. So we're going to work off of draft 4. I don't know if 3 and 4 are in there, or if just 4 is, but...
Okay, 4 is here for sure.
Okay, well, that's the one we're working on.
Okay.
It incorporates all the changes on 3. They still show in there. And that first paragraph, where we had sort of talked about what a special event was, is now a mirror image of what's in the policy that Attorney Costa has submitted to you. So that way, your policy and these regulations are sort of working off the same deck of what a special event is. And we talked some last time about one property hosting multiple special events and what the implications of that were and how that would be handled. And I think the reality of that is that's a zoning issue. And so I talk a little bit at the end of that paragraph about properly zoned properties are allowed to hold multiple special events. And again, that gets into ensuring that a property is zoned to hold each of those events or all of those events in some way, but it gives some discretion. We had some discussion about alcohol and drugs, specifically marijuana, and I think what has kind of come down in my discussions with Attorney Costa, and I'll invite him to jump in at any time, is obviously on town property, you can dictate that alcohol being sold for a fee is covered by your policies and state law. BYOB obviously doesn't apply in the context of things that are open to the public based on your current policy. I know that's on your agenda later this evening to discuss. But private events, as are covered by the definition proposed by Attorney Costa, get into a different space. And so alcohol provided at private events for free, or allowing individuals to attend private events and bring their beverage of choice would be not subject to requirements of liquor licensing. I think the last time we had a question about limiting the length of events, and I got, I think, as solid a confirmation as I can that it's not necessarily out of your purview to do that, and doing so is something that you could do if you so chose. I'm still proposing 4 days. I think that's a very lengthy event, and once you get into longer events, you have some other additional fallout that might come. Skipping back ahead to recreational drug use, obviously we can prohibit that in public property. So I inserted a clause in there that says that recreational use of drugs shall be prohibited on any permitted special event that takes place on town of Lunenburg property. Private property is a much dicier proposal, so I think we want to be on the right side of things for that. Restrooms and trash, a lot of the question that came up in regard to that were the cleaning schedules that were proposed previously reasonable, and were they something that were in line with the Board of Health? So I had a discussion with the Board of Health, and if one has a temporary toilet, the cleaning schedule is usually dictated by the owner of that toilet, and once daily is not an unusual or uncommon cleaning schedule. And I think with refuse pickup, what I did is I took out the daily and I assigned it to as dictated by the Board of Health, since they generally cover refuse anyway. I think for the rest of that, there wasn't a lot of discussion down until we get to buffer zone. We added the without proper licensing for fireworks. So if someone wants to jump through the firework hoops, they can do so. And generally, that's not going to be someone who drove to New Hampshire and bought a box of fireworks. It's going to be a professionally held event. So buffer zone, that was a big question about how buffer zones apply, what a reasonable buffer zone was. So what I tried to do is give a little guidance, but also give a lot of leeway. So I put 150 feet from residential property, not residential zones, but residential property. But the board can waive that with written permission from the affected abutter. There will be times, maybe numerous, maybe not, that someone is holding a special event and the residential abutter is like, yeah, bring it on. It can be right up to my property line. I don't care. But this gives them the industry to be able to put something in writing that informs the board of that and gives you something to balance your decision on. And then we really got into layout and plans and what sort of documentation people should be submitting. And I mean, I could write 40 pages of what someone should give me on plans or what we want to see, and I tried to kind of knock that down to a few bullet points. And really what I think we're looking at is what is this going to look like? And how is it going to impact the area? So site access, parking areas, restroom facilities, noting where the buffer zone is in conjunction with everything else that's happening on the site, location of abutting houses, so the board has a reasonable understanding of what proximity the event has to those who may be affected. And then there's a lot of stuff that may or may not be applicable. Food service, sleeping accommodations, wetlands, first aid station, alcohol serving areas, location of stage or entertainment, the route of the race, if it's a road race, or anything else that is important to the event that could impact the way that the board looks at it. And I think from there, there isn't a whole lot more that's changed. I corrected my typo, and I think think I've been as concise as I can, which is saying something since it's only 4 pages.
So I don't know where we want to start the discussion, but I had concerns about the buffer zone portion of it specifically. I know we wanted to put a distance in there, so we had it for reference, but I mostly don't like that you need the absolute agreement of a neighbor for us to consider an event, because there's, I mean, theoretically, the churches in town would be affected by this, the band concerts at the gazebo would be affected by this, farmer's market would be affected by this, and to assume that neighbors are always gonna be reasonable people is
Sure.
unreal. So you could have one person shutting down public events on municipal land in the center of town.
So is your opposition the distance, or?
I think if it's a reasonable event, the Board of Selectmen should be able to judge that and not require the neighbor to say yes. That could be a factor to help us say yes, but I don't think you should give the absolute power to a neighbor to be able to prevent.
That's only for the reduction of the buffer zone, though.
It's still there. I mean, like, if the United Parish wanted to do something,
Sure.
or if someone wanted to do something at the gazebo, you have neighbors within 150 feet of the gazebo.
And I guess that's what I'm saying is it, then do we look at maybe not 150 feet? Do we look at a smaller distance, or is there, you saying that the written permission is what you're concerned about, and maybe there's another way to sort of get around that?
Yeah, the written permission is what I have a problem with.
I would agree.
Yeah, I think if you did reduce this distance at their discretion upon reasonable requirements or documentation of why they need to be closer to the property line. So farmer's market currently is within 10 feet of the street.
Sure.
So therefore, that's why it has to be the limits of that. Whereas if you have a 200-acre parcel, and there's plenty of land there, there's no need for it to be 150 feet unless the driveway has to be there or something else has to be there. So they have to document the need for it to be closer, but still leave it in the discretion of the selectmen.
Should we have a buffer zone at all?
I would say yes.
Yeah, I'll go back to, I didn't have a buffer zone to begin with, and the board requested that it be in there.
I mean, if you think about an event that has loud music and lots of people and other things like that, there should be some setback from the property line to allow the abutting resident property to at least have a little bit of privacy.
Yeah, I see that for, a large event, but reading the definition of it, that's much smaller affairs would fall into this classification that would not require 150 feet or any offset.
And in that case, we would exercise our discretion and that in their application, the form actually says, do you need to have a reduction of the buffer zone?
Okay, so who issues the permit?
Selectmen.
Selectmen. So no matter what, the buffer zones and anything, it would come through for consideration anyways.
Correct.
So there'd be a process where people can intervene or, I mean, we can. I mean, if you look at something and we think, well, what about the abutters? I'm concerned. It would.
Sure. And so what I'm hearing is that you want to eliminate the notarized written agreement. Okay, I can understand that.
Well, I don't know. I didn't say that.
Well, no, I'm sorry. The royal you, not you specifically. And what I'm hearing is that the selectmen may reduce this distance at their discretion if the applicant provides due cause and reasonable protection for the residential abutters. I mean, is that the kind of direction that I'm hearing from the middle of the table?
Well, it does feel like a lot because you can put a shed like 20 feet from an abutter, like a structure.
Actually, you can put in 5 feet in a rear part of your property.
Okay. Oh, the actual addition of a house is 20 feet, I think.
That's right,
Yeah,
it's a
on
detached
side.
structure in the back can be 5 feet.
So thinking of things like that, it's, you know, a one-day event with some music being 150 feet away, but a permanent structure being 5, where somebody could have like a woodworking shop or something. I think if you think of it like that, 150 feet feels big.
As far as your middle of the table question, yeah, you got where I was going. I mean, I personally wouldn't have put the buffer zone there at all, but I'm trying to be reasonable and work with it.
I mean, do we want to take the buffer zone down to 100 feet and call it with due cause and reasonable protection somewhere in the, meet in the middle?
What is the proposed buffer zone in the current draft of the marijuana cultivation?
500.
500 feet.
Huge.
So we have quiet plants have to be 500 feet away. People using the plants can be 150 feet.
Well, hey,
I don't think 500 is the correct one, but this is where input from the public would be valuable to me for, we don't have a lot of special events in town, but, Stillman Fair.
and the majority of the ones that we have are right outside the doors here. Many of our special events are held on Memorial Drive and are in many ways affiliated with the town.
And they'll have residential neighbors.
Right.
They have residential neighbors. The bathroom provisions are fixed municipal bathrooms. We're not dealing with a lot of porta potties. We don't have many multi-day events, so daily cleaning isn't really an issue. We're talking about generally multi-hour events that happen on a singular day.
I think the point is really the needing neighbors' permission. I mean, you get somebody cranky moving in, they could make it difficult to use the gazebo.
And I'm not disputing that. I'm not saying that that's something that can't go. What I'm more just talking about in general where our events happen and what the shape of them are as we start to talk about what this buffer zone looks like and what's a reasonable space for the buffer zone and those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think it's good to have something to give the selectmen some guidance on, whether it's 150 or whatever it is, I don't know, and then have some discretion to waive that if there's a documented need to do it based on the event and the layout of the property.
But I don't know that you need to spell that out. I think if you say at the discretion of the selectmen, you would hope that the selectmen would use some sort of normal criteria.
Right, leave out the...
Without having to specifically say what that criteria is. I think it might be different depending on the situation. In practice, the one that came to my mind is when we did the car thing on Memorial Drive. It impacted 2 or 3 houses down that other part of Memorial Drive. The proponent of the event, which happened to be the police department, checked with them and they all said it's okay. If they said it wasn't okay and we thought about are they being reasonable, I don't know that we need criteria spelled out on what's reasonable, what isn't, but in good conscience, you do the right thing.
So if we just leave the Board of Selectmen may reduce this distance at their discretion.
I would think that would work.
I'd like that.
Yep.
We can always go back and change the policy if it's not working.
Mhm.
So the applicant doesn't have to provide anything, you're just doing it at your own discretion.
The assumption is the applicant will say, I want it to be less than 150, and they're probably going to tell us why.
Right.
But it's up to them to tell us why.
That's a big assumption in my experience.
Well, no, it's 150 unless we reduce it, but
Sure.
we're not going to exercise our discretion unless somebody asks us to.
Yep,
We might, usually.
works for me.
Just in terms of ground rules, this is our workshop and it's for us to come to this, but there are people here, if anybody feels that they have an opinion they want to share, I think we'd be happy to hear anybody if they want to. Sure. I have to ask you to come up here though, because we're on TV, all right?
The other thing I would note that this has not been publicized on our website, has it?
No.
So we're going to get comments, but people haven't actually seen the final text.
Good evening. My name's Steve Weaver from 288 Holman Street. And I want to make sure that I understood Adam. It's a zoning issue, right? I hear you talking about the churches and the center of town. Those are all public places where the gazebo is. I'm talking about a resident holding events where the music is so loud, it's over 150 feet. Even at Shady Point, music travels pretty loud across the lake, as some people may know. And I think that, 150 feet, if they had a special event where they had Battle of the Bands over there, then I think that quite a few people might be upset at that by listening to that all hours of the night. So I do have faith in the board and everything, making the right decisions and everything. But I think that, the zoning is the big issue, that if events are going to be held on residential property, then that's a problem. And I think that should be taken into consideration. Thank you.
Please, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, may I
Yes.
follow up with something? It's sort of a question for Adam, and that concept of this special event permitting and sort of there being a separation of the municipal land versus residential land. And as far as residential goes, I was wondering, and I've read through it and maybe I missed it, is there a possibility of putting some type of limit or guidance for us on if there's, repetitive requests of permits where it starts to feel more like a business than it is just, a once a year, twice a year thing? Where's the guidance on there? I feel like it would be nice to have something in here
Yeah, it would.
where you couldn't essentially have a special event every weekend, because then that puts you into, sort of an unexpected residential space.
Yeah.
Can we add that? Or, I think it would be nice to
Well,
add
and I
some
think
guidance.
that's what, if you look at the first paragraph, the last 2 or so lines, events that recur multiple times within a calendar year will not be considered special events. So if you have, I don't know, if you have a road race, it's an easy example, every weekend, you're not going to issue a special event license for that because it's the same, if, I don't know, they do the cancer run every weekend. It's no longer a special event, it's a weekly cancer run. And that gets out of the bounds of what this is. And then,
Where does it go?
Does it somehow get bounced to zoning or planning? Like, what would trigger?
Right.
It's,
Where does it move to?
that would take it out of special event. Then it's a regular event and you have to figure out how, I don't know how to permit that. We don't necessarily have a vehicle for permitting
so therefore it's not allowed.
theoretically, or you could create a category to have weekly events.
But if there's no category, it's prohibited.
But see, we're talking about 2 different things, because you're asking me about events, and you're applying the logic of it's not allowed, it's prohibited, which is zoning logic. So the event itself is not a zoning issue. Zoning is associated with property, and the event is sort of this weird amorphous thing outside of zoning.
But it's the use of the property by events.
Correct.
That if you do it every single day of the year, all of a sudden now you've changed the
On
use.
private residential property, that might be an issue. On a school property, if you had a weekly road race, maybe that could be considered an ancillary event to a school, and you kind of work into something different. And I think the last line that was added, properly zoned properties may hold multiple special events. That gets into, I think, the zoning issue that you're looking for. I don't think there's an easy way to say what you're asking this to say, because special events is not a category that has a statute associated with it.
I guess what I'm saying is I wouldn't want to sit here arbitrarily and say, I think you've had 6 events, and so I feel like saying no. Like, I feel like I'd want there to be guidance to say, well, typically, you know, the maximum special events on a residential property would be 5 per year. This is your 6th, so then I'm saying no. Like, I feel like you could run up to a point where you don't know what answer to give, and I don't like to make decisions based on just an opinion. I'd rather have it be based on something structured where it could be consistent and repeated to anybody and not just made as an arbitrary decision.
Yes, I understand that, and I guess there's nothing that would prohibit you from adding something like that in there, since you're creating these guidelines and this policy. But I don't know that zoning itself has necessarily a fixed number that would create that trip. There isn't a solid definition or a solid description of, well, once you've gotten to this point of special events, it takes you out of residential zoning, or it's not that black and white, unfortunately.
Even, if I may, even where you say events that recur multiple times within a calendar year will not be considered special events. And, you know, maybe you're having events and it's not the same event, so it's not a recurrence, it's an occurrence. And if you're saying events that recur or occur multiple times within a calendar year will not be considered special events, then you need to say, okay, the logical thing is they will be considered blah, you know, I mean, if they're not this, then they gotta be that. You need,
Or are they not allowed? Because I was trying to look up the word multiple, and it says several, which doesn't help me. So is that more than 2? So therefore 3 is multiple? So if you know, you're allowed 2, because it's only 2, but
But I think it really has to be broken down in the property type, because I'm thinking of like in Hickory Hills, like we have the beach and we have like the Pirate Fest and the Poker Run, and you wouldn't want to say, well, you can't have your events now, you've had 4, but that's not private, that's not residential property.
Yes, it is.
No,
Zoned residentially.
which,
Right, but I just,
But see, do you see
They
what I'm
don't come
saying?
to
Now,
the-
that's the issue with doing a hard and fast, because it's zoned residentially. So that property falls under the requirements of residential A zoning.
yeah.
So if you're going to limit the number of events you have within
You could
residential
start
A
impacting
district,
things.
you start impacting things that maybe you don't intend to impact. You want to maybe stop a private homeowner from turning their home or a group of homes or whatever into an event venue where maybe somebody has a really nice house and they want to let people get married there, and it turns into this thing that you feel is out of control, so you start restricting residential A, but then you're impacting your ability to use as in the Hickory Hills Association, ability to use their beach, or something, you know, events happening at the town beach for multiple times in the year. And that's kind of what I'm trying to illustrate with it's not there's no hard and fast, and zoning is just like this awful shade of gray.
so would Hickory Hills need to apply for these special event permits then?
Yes, they would.
Yeah, you see, I actually, at the risk of dragging us into it, well, I think we have to have this discussion. How do you define a special event? I think if I want to have 4 people over to dinner at my private residence, I should be able to do that every night of the week, 365 days a year. So now that we've established that, assuming we have, how many people, how much music,
50.
where does it, excuse me?
50 people.
is what it says.
So if I want to have 60 people at my house
You need a special
for a
event.
private party, I need a special event permit?
Correct.
Then I'm going to vote against this.
Yeah,
I am.
That's fine.
It's true, because we certainly go to parties where there's more than 50 people.
Absolutely. I think we need, that's why I said at the risk of going down, I think we need to define special event a little differently. Because when you introduce music, or you introduce alcohol, or you introduce the public, maybe they're the criteria.
That's
I
where I
thought-
think the
However,
distinction was
if
made
I was your neighbor and you
originally.
had 60
Yeah, I thought we
people
had-
It
over
was
every night.
general, open to the general public.
Yeah, so I think.
That's what I was wondering, we
that
used to say
language-
general public.
That was the
Well,
original.
hold on, let's, one at a time, please.
Originally, it was to the general public. I think either this morning or last evening, I got a draft of what Attorney Costa proposed, and I tried to mirror that with what he had in his, and his was a little bit more restrictive than what I had, and so I was unaware that he had been working on a policy, so what I took some inference that he had some direction and tried to mirror that to pull it into what we had been talking about so far. Perhaps I missed the mark on that and should have stuck with the general public, which I had, but.
I think the general public's an important distinction because I've had 50 people at my house before, and it's not that tough to hit 50 people.
It's not.
I don't think I know 50 people.
Some people are related to 50 people.
I know, I can do that with the family.
Right, I definitely have family parties that get pretty close to that. So I think the general public part of it is something that needs to be defined. When,
Please, up here.
Hi, Darren Massey, 300 Holman Street. So I think the word I want to keep repeating, and I've said it before at this microphone, is reasonableness. I think as we look at all the numbers of people, as we look at the zoning, as we look at the property lines, as we look at the number of events, I think if we can keep the word reasonable in our mind, this is a reasonable town. We've had multiple highly popular events in this town that many, many people who are not here would like to have those events back. Events are critical in the health of our town, in the social health of our town. They're also critical in the economic health of our town and the marketing of our town. If we continue to express unreasonableness in our bylaws, it continues to discourage people to attempt to bring their interests to this town, besides for living in a sleepy, quiet town where people stay in their houses and do not learn and do not have the opportunities to meet each other. I commend the chief of police for doing the event he does. I commend the other people for doing the events they do. Multiple people in this room are part of very active communities who attempt to do various events for the social and economic health of our town. What I hear tonight is the various people who have spoken so far may be prone, as I see it, to limit the regulations and possibility and even perception of this town allowing reasonable activities to partake in this town. Even before this may go into effect, you've mentioned various lake activities, you've mentioned, or at least inferred, other activities where people will continue to be discouraged, and the atmosphere that's extremely popular and extremely inviting, such as on the lakes, will be limited. And I'll leave it at that. The other point I wish to stress, besides for reasonableness, is the economic benefits. I hear that this has gone through town council. That lens may curtail what you're looking at here. I see it going through the land use director. Only that lens may curtail a reasonable view of what you're looking at in this workshop. Adding a view of the business elements of what you're talking about here may help to include a reasonable nature of coming to a final product that makes reasonable sense to this town as well as that other towns surrounding us have in place. Third point would be to request that you look at the towns surrounding us, to look at their processes and look at their events that they allow that are reasonable, that are time limited, that are people limited, that have buffers, that have noise ordinances, that are reasonable. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr.
So,
Sorry.
So I was just going to say that there's a couple of things at play here, is that we've got a zoning discussion, which is not within our bailiwick, but I think that's an underlying discussion about when does a residential use turn into something that's not residential because of the frequency, let alone the actual individual. I mean, theoretically, if somebody put up a grocery store for a day, that's a violation because it's a retail use, you can't do that, but that also wouldn't be a special event. And then we've got, assuming it's allowed anywhere in residential, because that's where the issues are, we want to have a way of knowing about it, regulating it, being reasonable about it, but at the same time being reasonable about the people around it. So Katie's been talking about, what's the impact within zoning, and we're not going to do zoning within here because that's not the right place to do it, but should we be looking at zoning clarification, or is this so nebulous that you can't do it? No, you're shaking your head yes.
I think with the zoning aspect, you get into who's the zoning enforcement officer and how do they interpret and what is the process that they go through. And, it's not as nebulous as that, but there is certainly some case facts that are going to impact each individual issue. And I don't know that there's a way to codify the zoning aspect of it. And I mean, if I'm ignorant of something, I'd hope town council would.
But you do
just
refer to it, you say properly zoned properties may hold multiple special events given the appropriate permits are in place. So there's somewhat of, you're giving some credence to, there's something properly zoned for some special events.
Correct.
So I think before I'm ready to vote on this, I'd want to have some of those examples of when are those properly zoned events.
I'd rather just take that out. Only because it was a response to something that the board asked for, and the more we talk about it, the more uncomfortable I am with the language that I used.
I mean, theoretically, you should be able to do what you legally can do.
Correct.
Period. And then what are we regulating?
I think it has, Mr. Chair, if I may.
Sure.
Adam, I feel like what I keep thinking of is having a more clear, very specific definition
Of a special event or of the special event. I feel like it's so vague, like I'm wandering through all these different thoughts and different events and then not being sure whether or not they'd fall under the need for this. Because so if I'm gonna have 60 people over for a small wedding for a family member, like one time, and I have a tent in my yard, or my neighbor's doing it, I'm not gonna really see that as like an evented, I practically host birthday parties that would fall into this. So it feels confusing to me, and I feel like a special event is like is something to do with who's invited, the general public. I mean, obviously, if I'm having a birthday party for my twins, it's just really a personal event, and it's something that's happening maybe once a year. And I don't want to get into people's personal lives, but when there's a general public, or even I could say almost like a semi-general public, where something's really widely advertised, that's much, much different than my child's large birthday party. So I guess just a more clear idea of what we're defining as a special event that needs a permit. Because all of a sudden, you have events like on private property, like where there's like a pirate day or something, and it's all private property, and it doesn't feel like it needs a town permit, and so I wouldn't want to trigger all these unusual circumstances where we're just permitting everybody's movements throughout town. But then at the same time, what I think of the most is residential property being used as residential property where it's to be expected, Like, my neighbors, they probably don't like my birthday parties and their dogs bark all day, but that's one time. But if I was doing that, you know, I guess I'm just, I defining the special event. And then as far as the special event permits, like, I don't think that it has anything to do with including business owners and things, because business owners who are having events don't need this. To me, this is like an unexpected event, something out of the ordinary. Like, even thinking of band concerts falling into it feels funny. I guess I'm just confused about what's going to go through this process, and if we're just creating this enormous, confusing situation.
Thank you for verbalizing my head over the last 3 weeks.
Okay.
Because if you added the words "to which the public is invited," that clarifies, but that automatically picks in the band concert. It actually
tricky.
picks up the football games.
Well, the football games are not a special event. They're a regular sporting event held in conjunction with the school.
So what about the wine tastings that are done in town?
What
Would that
wine
be a special
tastings?
event?
At Central Mass, out here in the Village District, the Elena's wine
Well,
invites people to the public, and you pay to go in. We've never permitted that.
But isn't that part of her business operation? I mean, that's,
But it's outside her 4 walls, because it's in the courtyard of the village.
And she gets a one-day permit for that?
I don't
We don't
think
know
so.
what, I'm just thinking of
Yep.
different events that happen in town.
to me, I think the band concert's something different. I
What do we
mean,
write in
the
it?
band is a town event on a town property, and I don't see that as a special event of any
Well,
sort.
this says public and private at the moment.
Yeah, but I think that's someone who doesn't,
Stillman's Fair,
well, that's his private
That's a
property.
special event.
that's a special event.
Yeah,
Invited to the public, widely advertised,
okay,
everywhere.
I'm fine with that.
You know,
Yeah, that
And I
would probably
think
need-
what I've
Okay, hold on.
I think what I've sort of struggled with in response to what you're saying, Katie, is I could give you a list, and then what's going to happen is 3 months from now, someone's going to roll into town and throw up an event that's not on the list and say, "Pfft, I don't need a special permit. I don't need a special event permit." And everyone's going to go, "Why didn't you think of that, Adam?" And so it's...
And Adam, in the opposite of a list, could we do exemptions? Because I know, like, the noise one, there's like, you can, you know, snow is not
Sure.
included. Sometimes if we can really identify the things we don't want to fall into this.
And I think that's probably a
holistic
more
exemptions
reasonable
would be
tack for
easier.
doing that. You know, these are regular events held in conjunction with the town, or
So
something
not
like
to
that.
include band concerts or
Yeah, yeah.
something like that.
See, when I look at this, the open to the general public on private property and private events held on public property. That's how I would see the distinction.
Okay, yep.
That I can live with, because that's, but because when I look at the band concert, it's open to the public, but it's on public property run by the town.
Right.
I don't see that as a special event requiring any kind of special permit.
it is the way it is here.
Right,
But I
but
like the
yeah.
way you said, private property open to the public, public property open with a private event.
Right.
That, if you had language like that, that gets better. It would
And
still
to
have-
go back to my original concern, I don't think the number of people that I have to my house is what triggers it. But if I bleed over into something like creating a traffic congestion or needing some public property to make that happen, then I might need a special permit for it. It's not the number of people that came, if they're all invited guests.
So we
It's
The
the
way
fact, where are they
Heather
gonna
just said it
park?
fixes
What's it gonna
that.
do to traffic? Do I need to do it at the gazebo, which goes to what
Say
the
that
town
again.
manager said?
Say that again, Heather.
That's how we
Public
record
on
these
pri-
things.
Open to the general public on private property and private events held on public property.
So somebody rents the gazebo for a wedding,
Right.
and theoretically, they could have a band there.
Then
And they could have more than 50 people there,
And they need a permit for that.
if we
Because
followed
it's-
the current language that's there. I mean, I also think that noise is an important part.
But I think we handle that with the noise bylaw, separate and apart
We'll have
from
to,
this.
we'll have to take a look at that, of how that plays out on here. Because
We at
this
least have the
one-
timing on here.
This one, the event says you can't do any activities before 7 or after 8 PM.
Oh, I thought I changed that.
And we
I thought we went to 6 and 10 to match the noise bylaw.
Still,
It's still 7 at the moment.
yeah.
But it's still, so we're basically saying that you can have a party, but you have to stop having the event at 8 PM.
It's tough for the
Should
wedding
say
I had
10.
planned. Mr. Chair, there was a question in the audience over here.
Okay, well, we'll take it in 1 sec. Do we have what the town manager was trying to articulate? Did your question get answered?
Yes. I
Okay,
understood.
fine, please.
So I'm Thea St. Martin. I live at 488 Holman Street, and I just had a couple comments. I actually thought that what Darren mentioned as far as reasonable is really, really key, because obviously one person's reasonable is other person's completely unreasonable, and that sort of drives home the fact that you should put in some sort of buffers. And then, if there are specific reasons why you feel as a group under your jurisdiction that you should change that for a specific event, that seems reasonable. There's that word again. So, it's you need some guideline to know when to move the guideline, if you understand what I'm saying. The other thing I just want to say, which is sort of off topic, but I really don't understand why having a quiet rural neighborhood is a problem. Like, why is it bad that Lunenburg is a quiet rural family town? What's wrong with that? That's why I live here. That's why I moved here. That's why I want to stay here. But I just have a very big problem with this opinion that there's something wrong with it and we need to change it, So thank you for your time.
Now, would Heather's definition affect events at Hickory Hills? Because it's private property that the public is invited to.
Well, what public?
Fix that concern.
Say you had Hickory Hills, all Hickory Hills residents come to the beach. And it's a day-long event. The question becomes open to the public. It may be a limited set of the public, but it's certainly not family.
That's not open to the public, though. With Heather's definition, it would fall back into a private event with private property. Because it's a private association, wouldn't be public. Heather's,
They don't allow people who don't live on the lake there?
for these events, Heather's definition would remove the town from overseeing private people's
No, they don't allow the
functions.
public.
Correct.
Landowners can have guests, but they don't allow the public.
Okay.
So Heather's definition really fixed a lot of what was floating around in my mind as concerns of us needing to put this policy into places where it was just going to get tricky, because you go back into, okay, well, that's a private spot and it's not open to the public, so it's void of needing a permit, which
So-
makes sense to me.
So I'll give an example outside of town. Hollis Hills Farm is now in Fitchburg. And I still follow them because I support them. They're a farm. They now have many events where they have music. They have many events where they have alcohol. They have many events where they serve food outside, other things like that. That is becoming a venue. That theoretically could happen in town here. I don't know how the zoning works. Some of it relates to the farm use, but some of the other stuff goes beyond the farm, and I don't know how their zoning provides. We can't deal with every situation, but we've got enough situations where people want to use their property one way and the neighbors don't like it. And that's what we're trying to address to an extent within our limits of authority.
But to follow that example, I think I would say that from the get-go, if we had a similar situation to Hollis, from the get-go, it would require a special events permit, and at some point, it may bleed over into a zoning issue.
So right now,
depending on how we...
if they do more than 4, or they do multiple, so say Stillman's Farms had its event every weekend, and it was from May through September, every single weekend. How do you regulate that? Because I think if you're serving alcohol, if you're doing other things here, assuming they then address the parking and they get the porta potties and other stuff like that. Is that okay in town?
Well, what are they zoned? Because they're already a business and a store.
It's residential.
Okay.
It's farm-related business. For that is allowed by law. But when you move beyond the farm business by having music and serving alcohol, I mean, farm to table, maybe they raise the grain that go into the alcohol. So you can get closeness there. I think this is much better than it was before. It needs some more work, what we talked about tonight, but I think we need to have some additional discussions on this. I'm particularly interested in the zoning implications because this special permit thing is not going to be, unless we change it, is not going to regulate private use of property that's effectively commercial. We had the same discussion about whether solar is commercial or not. It's generating electricity, is that a commercial? But the answer is no, that doesn't qualify for that because of the state law. But if somebody is using their property every single week, charging admittance fees, do they get a one-day beer and wine license? They get a one-day beer and wine license every single week during the summer. To me, it feels like it's becoming like the old Buttercup or some other things like that, that it's a venue that feels more commercial than just the backyard party. And I think that's what we're trying to guard against, is when is it becoming commercial versus reasonable use of private property.
And I don't know that this is ever going to do that, because that's zoning related and it's tied up with individual properties, the facts of each individual case, and the interpretation of how zoning is applied to each of those individual properties. So, I don't know that this special event permit can ever incorporate or outline or provide guidance from or to zoning.
But I think it can say, and I'm not sure if for is the right answer, but I think it can say, if you do more than X number of these things, we're going to start saying no to your special event permit. And if you still want to keep doing it, you got to find another avenue, and it may be zoning.
But, and correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is this is being issued to the event organizer. So if the Girl Scouts, the Boy Scouts, the Lions Club, 4-H, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and Roar all come in, and they all have events that are completely different, and they're all located at the same property. Whereas the zoning issue goes to the property owner, right. Your event license is to each of those individuals. The Boy Scouts are having a camping jamboree. The Girl Scouts are having, a mock UN. The 4-H club is having a cow show. I mean, you can talk about vastly different events that are all happening in a singular location, that each event in and of themselves would be considered a special event and are interrelated, and perhaps that property is zoned in a way that could compensate or could allow those each to happen. Perhaps it's not, and so the special event itself isn't tied up in the legality of the property to hold it. That's another issue that goes back to the property owner, not necessarily to the event itself.
Unless we require the property owner to be the co-applicant.
Well, then you get into a different situation, but, there's so much conflict in what the intent of this is and how it gets applied that there isn't necessarily an easy answer to do this, because there's only going to be so many places that these special events can be held. And what happens when these special events are held on town property? Does the town become the co-applicant, or are the Board of Selectmen going to sign off on an application to themselves, and after 4 events look at themselves and go, sorry guys, no more events?
So that brings up a point I was just thinking of I think it's a good new word, a bifurcated approach to the special event permit. There's such a difference between a permit to private property and then the use of municipal land. But I feel like they both trigger some of the same ideas for me. So you have municipal land, like the band concert, and then somebody's using it once a week privately. Well, that's still too much. I think in either scenario that Heather laid out, multiple occurrences of the same thing become maybe something odd for town. So you have the town common, and then somebody privately wants to host something there every Friday. That feels like that's too much.
But is it the same person or is it different?
If it were the same
But
person.
that's just it. You could make the applicant say, where are you going to have it? And they have to come up with a venue that's acceptable. And if a place becomes the venue of choice for every different group, then all of a sudden we have to look into, well, is that a business, is that a venue business, or is that somebody's property?
I mean, and Memorial Drive is a good example of that. That's something that gets used regularly for special events, and it's a fantastic place for it. But
if any of the abutters had a problem with it, we may have to deal with it if it was all the time.
and
you don't
perhaps,
see it.
yeah.
And we don't have bands, and we don't serve alcohol, and we don't have to have, it's not, almost all those events are not 4-day events and things like that, so.
And I'm not trying to suggest that it is this, party atmosphere that's wild and crazy, but I think what we have to look at is this needs to be equally applicable both on private and public property. You don't want to create a dichotomy where one is more difficult or less difficult than the other, and there's a reasonable process that applies to both. My understanding of what we were trying to do is get a handle on how these events happen, how they're worked. Stillman's Fair is 3-4 years into their annual event, and they've got a really nice process. They involve the public safety departments, the DPW. They come up with a really great plan. They get people out there to manage the traffic. And sort of formalizing that type of planning event was my understanding of what we were kind of trying to do with this, is not only lay out some guidelines for the board to look at and for people to understand, but to also provide a process that allows people to have a dialogue with the town on how these events get held that's reasonable, and not to create some sort of push to either get all of these to happen on public property or all on private property, or make it really easy on public and really hard on private, but sort of let them happen. And I don't want us to get to a point where we're diverging public property, private property, and creating two sets of rules, because I think that gets really confusing.
Although you can have two separate rules, because the town manager is in town of all property except for that under the jurisdiction of the conservation or the school. So theoretically, she could already say no to some things, assuming it was done reasonably. But I think that we've got zoning issues that we're effectively trying to manage here.
Sir, well, I have 3 requests. 1, 2, 3. You could be 4. You, sir. And I do believe this one is one of the 2 that are going to take most of our energy. I don't think we're going to have this much energy on all of them, but...
Sorry to be a pain in the neck, maybe lower, but my name's Steve Weaver, and I'm at 288 Holman Street. And we're concerned as neighbors that the 300 Holman Street is going to turn into a business, being a residential property. I don't think anybody is upset about birthday parties or anything like that. That's why we feel that that's a zoning issue. It was brought to the zoning board before, and it was denied or withdrawn. And with the noise that comes out of that, and with the smoke from the fires, we can't leave our windows open at night because of the smoke from the fires, from the dancing, and all the other events that were held there. By being invited on Facebook and charged for those events, that's a little different than a little Christmas party or at your house, or a birthday party at your house. That's sort of a business. And that's why I'm here tonight, is to, make sure that the zoning aspect of it is taken into consideration. And again, I say, you know, if you don't monitor or take into consideration the noise event or the traffic or all the complaints that our fire department and our police department have to handle and the extra workload on that because of all of this, it's a shame that our nice small town is turning into that. But thank you for hearing me.
Thank you. Sir?
Tom Alonso, 284 Lancaster Avenue. So having not read it, because it wasn't available, but just hearing, it certainly sounds like the description or the definition, first of all, sounds a lot like nailing Jell-O to a tree. So the only thing that kind of made sense to me is getting the public on private property. But in today's social media, there's probably, off the top of my head, I can probably think of half a dozen ways around that. So really it comes down to me, I'd like to take 3 steps back and talk about what the intent was, why this came forward to begin with. And if I understand it correctly, and from what I've heard from other people speaking, it has to do with, you know, protecting the neighborhood that they are comfortable with and they have grown accustomed to, and balancing that against property owners' right to do what they want to do on their property, obviously within reason. Now, having big parties, as many people here have already said, is not necessarily uncommon. So how do you protect the neighbors from things like that? I think you do it by all the other avenues available to you. You make noise ordinances. You make parking ordinances and safety ordinances. You make health ordinances. If you have porta potties that are going to be on the property, you make sure that they're complied with and they're checked. And you can be very, I don't want to say aggressive, you can be very assertive with those ordinances to protect the neighborhood. If parties get out of hand and they're too loud, then they should be cited for that, no matter who they are. It doesn't matter if it's private or public. If there's parking on the street, I mean, I have a problem with parking in the street sometimes when people have graduation parties. It's very dangerous in some places. People are parking on one side of the street and you have barely a lane to go by for two-way traffic. So I would argue, unless you can define what this is, I would argue against this particular inclusion of a special license and focus more on really enforcing and enhancing the other protections so that the neighbors in the neighborhood feels protected, but also so that the property owner has the ability to enjoy their property to the point that they want to. If they want to have 50 people and have a barbecue or whatever they want, and they fit within those protection bylaws, I don't see why it should be prohibited, even if it was every weekend. I mean, it's them enjoying their property. So I think there's a way to do both. Just don't think this policy is one of them.
Thank you. I had one over here. Did you move? Was it you?
I think both. Chief?
Who? The chief? Did you want to say something?
Well, I was going to speak to the...
Quick. You got to use the mic if you're going to do it.
On the subject, some of my questions were answered.
You got to use the mic, Jim. I'm sorry. You can do it right here. If
I was just... My thought was that, well, I was looking at the city of Cambridge has a special event licensing bylaw, and of course in a city like that they have a committee that reviews the bylaw and or that reviews the permits, and in doing so, makes a determination as to issues of public safety, just as under 141.1, I believe is 141.81, as to whether or not they should issue the permit based on the location, any traffic issues, or other public safety issues, public health issues, Board of Health issues, and so on and so forth. It's primarily what you're doing here. And I think, as the town manager said, what really triggers that is the public attending. The other thing that triggers that money's being passed, different than what some of the examples you gave, like the Hickory Hills thing is a private organization. If I cook a big dinner, I might have 50 people over my house too, because that's just my family. So that doesn't really trigger the public event, the special event thing, because it's not really the public. So the public, you're right, is what triggers it. So my thought was that, does that change the definition of a residence? A residence, if you look up the definition of a residence, it's for living, it's for dwelling. It's not made for special events, it's not designed for that. That's not the intent. That's the intent of a business. So does it change the definition of a dwelling if you start to use it as a business? And I think that's where the question came up. Somebody said, well, what if I do it every other weekend or every weekend or whatever? Does that change the definition of a residence now, and it has to be kicked over to somebody else like zoning or planning? So planning, and this is what the city of Cambridge talks about, planning. So they have to plan. Okay, if you're going to have businesses at your house, this is what you need, and set guidelines. You need so many parking spaces and so on and so forth. So that's all I was going to say. Is it seems to me it totally changes the definition of a residence if I'm going to use it for something other than that. As far as the zoning, of course, don't forget, and I said this last week, the whole landscape has changed in this town, so this is always going to be a challenge. There's been businesses in this town for years, and all of a sudden houses cropped up, very expensive houses cropped up around these businesses. One example is the Leominster Rod and Gun Club. Houses all of a sudden started popping up around that, and now what do you have? Complaints about firearms going off at certain hours of the day. That's what happens. So, that's different though. That business was there first. So now you take one of those houses and turn it into a business. It's not the intent of it. So the people around that house, they're going to complain. We're going to have to deal with it. This is what has prompted that, and it's going to continue to be a challenge. But my opinion is, you're right. It's the public that triggers this whole thing. You're going to act as just as Cambridge has a committee. That's what the Board of Selectmen is essentially, is a committee that's going to have to come up with some kind of post hoc rationalization for whatever anybody presents to them to see if it's okay to have a special permit. And I don't know, that was just some of my thoughts.
Thank you.
Hi, Kathleen Winnook, 503 Holman Street. I'm one of the cranky neighbors. And I think we all agree that Hickory Hills it's a private organization. They have outings there and special events all the time. Fine. The farmers market in the middle of the town, awesome. Stillman's, awesome. All of these places are great. I live on a quiet little street. You can barely fit a car and a half to go down it. We are social people, but when we're home, we like it quiet. Yes, every once in a while there are parties. I mean, I've got Eric Short who lives across the street from me, and at the end of the year, all the teachers go there, and it's fine. It's like, I even told them, you want to park in my yard, that's fine. People have weddings, people have graduations. We understand that's life. But having an event on your street that's advertised on Facebook, and sometimes there were some that were advertised as a public event, and suddenly it got changed around to, oh, it's private, but still it was public. That's really different. And having people there that you don't know, people wandering around in the woods, it makes some of us really nervous. It's not just the noise and the health of the streams, because there have been things that have been put into Mulpus Brook. I'm really more concerned about what's going on with Mulpus Brook and what pollution is going in there, because there was a stage that was built in the water. But I think we're reasonable people. We know the difference between public and private, and this is something public, a business that's happening in a very quiet little street, and it's kind of frightening. And we're all really worried about our property values. I know there's someone on the street who's trying to sell her property, and she's like, oh my God, what am I going to do? I can't let anyone know that this is going on this street. How am I going to sell my house? No one wants to move to a place like that. So, thank you.
Thank you. One last, please.
Thank you. I appreciate the conversations, including reasonableness. So I want to thank the one neighbor for mentioning that word as well. It's good to have this forum so that we can share in public. The other word I would like to stress is that we have a reality-based conversation of actually what's happened in town in the past, in the history, and what's happened in the more recent history, and what we would like in the future. If we could keep to fact, I think that would serve everybody, and keep this conversation factual. The other points I want to respond to, the business side mentioned how this conversation might impact businesses. The example of Stillman's was mentioned. Numerous vendors partaked at Stillman's. Numerous people in town as well as outside of town came to that event. There are other examples like that, that many connections, business connections were made from that. Many social connections as well were made from people, and including some talent forms were even completed at that fair for public to participate in town committees and meetings. So again, if we can keep this conversation to reasonable and factual, to continue to support the town moving forward. The other point that I did hear about was noise. Again, for myself, it goes back to the reasonable quality, where various sectors of the town are looking to partake in this conversation, not to have unreasonable events and events that bypass reasonable noise levels. And so I'd like to support the other speaker in mentioning that so long as there are reasonable terms, noise, safety, traffic, health, and that those are met, then that would offer protections for most factual conversations. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. You got a lot of input. I do believe we still have some work to do on this one.
I think so.
Next step, would you want
That
Adam
was
to-
gonna be my question. Where do I go from here?
Yeah, to revisit the comments made at tonight's meeting, come back to a future agenda, and then once you're pretty much comfortable with a draft, have a public meeting on it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I'd also be interested in seeing what some other towns have. I mean, I'd be interested in seeing the Cambridge one, even though that's urban. If we look at what they're trying to deal with and make sure we do it, that matches what Lunenburg's values are, then we've covered all the bases. I was reading the noise bylaw, and it talks about even during the day, you can't have really, really loud music, and there's a specific limit in that noise bylaw. So that may address the noise issue. I don't know specifically whether we have regulations regarding traffic and parking for an event. We have it in zoning, but I'm not sure whether we have it for, if this were to come, any of these to come for us, you know, Board of Health we always talk about, and they've already dealt with many different settings on that. Traffic on Lancaster Ave is different than traffic on Holman Street, and, especially it's a dead end. So if we're talking about different standards by which we may decide to give or not give a permit, and there's some reasonable standards that are out there already that we can refer to by reference, that might be good too.
Okay, Mr. Chair, if I may. My favorite thing out of the whole conversation was what Heather said. I feel like a lot of things that were spinning around and making me start to worry about the policy stopped when you applied that to it.
Yep.
And that sort of, whether or not you come up with two separate things or just specifically define that as what's guiding the process. And then I feel like there's an absence of exceptions. I like simple exceptions. If we could very clearly define something like the weekly summer band concerts and just define things that aren't going to get entangled, even if it's just a few, so that, because I think those started to get us all a little bit, I mean, I don't want to have to like say yes to every band concert and then say, whoops, we just had 5, so we need to stop. But then on that note, I think putting limits really helps my mind think about when you start protecting a neighborhood or neighbors could really be done through trying to define what a limit is on a property so that everybody has the right to participate in events and things up until a point. And I think then the point is when you're affecting something beyond what is reasonable. But I think if we could define what we feel is reasonable, then we can say we've reached an unreasonable point. And I think limits to me is really when things cross over in terms of anything is reasonable up until a point. So I would say finding out how we would define limits and then listing some exceptions and then clearly defining that there's the private property, public property, and the difference there, like Heather said.
So do you want me to define limits, or do you want me to put in some general statement and the 5 selectmen will determine what they feel their limits are?
Looking at some defined ones would feel good, and then reading it and seeing if it feels right and going from there.
Can I just put on this while you're talking about it? What you're doing, right, you're already doing all this. You realize that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you issue those issue permission to do these road blocks for the money, you know, for raising money. When we did the car show, we took care of the pedestrian issues, we took care of the traffic issues, we took care of the neighbor issues, and so on and so forth. Again, if you go back to the Cambridge one's pretty good guidance, because that's what they encourage you to get everybody together, make a plan for special events and cover all these bases. And essentially, you've been doing that right along. You just want to put it in writing, so.
Right, I agree.
And of course, you know, you get good guidance, you know, under 181, you know, there's 3 things that they look at that might, you know, issuance of a license, things you want to consider. And again, it goes to reasonableness. Unreasonable, increasing pedestrian traffic in an area which a premise is located. Unreasonable. So if it's reasonable, okay. Increasing the incidence of disruptive conduct in the area in which the premise is located, or unreasonable increasing the level of noise in an area where a premise is located. So, you know, all of these things, take those into account. I think, you know, that might be helpful in drafting this document.
So why don't we make it an agenda item as soon as we can, taking into consideration what we heard tonight. Try to come up with a straw that we like, and then maybe we will have a public hearing where we can air that out and hear, you know, have that well publicized ahead of time, and we'll hear.
With a draft that
Right.
is public.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we'll move on from that one for tonight. Thank you very much, everybody, for
Thank
your
you.
input.
Have fun wonking out.
Next one is access to town council.
Yes. So I would open the Board of Selectmen Policy and Regulations Workshop 10/16/18 with comments from AGC Redlines. Its attorney cost as comments included in that draft. So
Great.
you'll be able to see both his and my track changes. So access to town council, the wording that is proposed to be included is use of town council monthly office hours is restricted to town employees, board, committee, and commission members, and legal questions must directly pertain to matters within their realm of jurisdiction and cannot be for personal interests. This just as a restatement what is already occurring, just to make it clear for anyone viewing our policy on use of town council, and now that we have monthly office hours, that not anyone can go to office hours and ask questions related to something that may just pertain to them and not be a board or committee question that they sit on, that they have questions on. Also to address Citizen petitions, this is a practice we already assist citizens through the process of providing them, Elaine provides them the form that they can circulate, and they know that the question is on every form that they submit with the signatures, with the same wording, and it has been reviewed by council questions in the past, sometimes not prior to submission, usually after. So we're, as Adam referred to earlier, we're stuck with the wording on the warrant as it was submitted, because we can't amend it after the fact. But the additional wording, town manager will assist citizens interested in submitting citizens petitions for town meetings by acting as the conduit between town council with the legality and form of citizen petition articles.
I'd make a motion, we accept the proposed change to section 2.01, access to town council.
Second. Can I just amend that to town manager may? That was Adam's recommended change.
Town manager may assist citizens.
Can I add something, Mr. Chairman? So there's actually there's a second modification as well, and I'll give my rationale for this. So certainly I'm in favor of citizens petitions being submitted early, well in advance of town meeting, to give us an opportunity to modify it. And by that I mean even before signatures are obtained, because once they're obtained then it's submitted. Again, we're stuck with the language we've got. The only concern I had here is the suggestion that, number one, there's an obligation on the part of the town manager, the town council, to assist with this submission, and number two, that this language that says by acting as the conduit between town council with the legality and form of citizens petition articles. So now you're placing the town and town council in a position where we're opining on the legality of articles, when really the burden is on the citizen pursuant to state law to do their due diligence and their research and present something. Again, we're happy to work with them, but it puts the town in a difficult position, particularly if these things are submitted, on the eve of a deadline. Now suddenly we're supposed to opine on the legality of these. So the suggested language I had still sort of welcomes citizens with open arms to submit these petitions and acknowledges that we'll assist them. It would say the town manager may assist citizens interested in submitting citizens petitions for town meeting, and may seek the advice of town council relative to the form and substance of these petitions and their lawfulness and effect, which is a little different than suggesting that the town manager is acting as a conduit between town council, which again suggests that these residents have direct access to town council to get legal advice on their petitions, which is sort of counter to what you said in the previous sentence, which is that individual citizens don't have that sort of access. Town council represents the town, the Board of Selectmen, not individual citizens.
Mr. Chair, if I may, having done a citizen petition and been involved in them, a lot of communities really encourage them and come up with a way to help guide. And when you look at what our style of government's supposed to be, the town, every single citizen is a member of the legislative body, and I feel like they should be considered a part of the town in the process, and they're supposed to be participating. And so having been on the other side of this, I feel like really defining and carving out their ability to participate is something I've felt, and so I like the will, because it says she will be a conduit, and I think somebody should be available for a citizen who's working on something, especially if they're a paid employee of the town. All members of the town should be looked at as somebody who should at least be acknowledged or capable of participating. And it doesn't say they will have access, it says they will have a conduit, and I think there should be some responsibility to somebody in town to welcome the legislative body of government into this executive part and somehow let it blend and not treat it as two totally separate entities.
I kind of prefer the council's wording. I think it does offer assistance and welcomes citizens to participate in government as you so rightly stated they are our legislative branch, but by the same time it protects the town as an entity on the legal level.
I guess I'd say who is town, and to me when I was just a citizen, I felt like I was town too, and I don't like when we define that we as town is separate as them as town, and that's what we're doing here. The word may is very dangerous because may means you can simply say no.
But I think the may protects the town from potential.
From its residents.
No, from potential huge legal expenses, you know, and I also, it would be nice also to have something about time where they have to do it so much ahead of time so it's not at the last minute.
I would support leaving will and adding time as a way to control the situation.
I think you need the discretion, though.
Right.
I mean, yes, the town is working to serve the people, but if you call up the DPW director and says there's a pothole in front of my house, get down here and fix it, he's going to put it on his list. Or if you call the chief of police and say, I need someone to come down and patrol speeding in front of my house, to the extent he can, he will. But he's not, you don't get to tell a town employee that they're going to help you. I mean,
No,
it's
this
got
is
to be.
for a specific thing, though. This is for specifically,
Okay, but what if someone comes on with a citizen's petition that's absolutely egregious? Like, I want a citizen's petition
Then they
to
need
fly
help.
the Confederate flag in the center of
then
town.
they need help.
But still,
They need a conduit.
So I guess that for me, I'd be okay with the will if it's not the legality. Because that's the part that I realized that as I was reading it, really, I think that we should be helping people with the form of the citizen petition for this is a proper thing to come before town meeting. This is a thing that it can be voted upon, but not whether this is a legal thing, because I think that that's going too far. So I think that will assist in, I mean, I like the conduit, and what, could you read the last part of that part as far as?
Sure. So the modification I propose, and to preface it, certainly it's, and I think I prefaced my comment before, to Selectman Adams' point, it's not my objective to close the door. I agree that citizens petitions should be encouraged and there should be assistance with them. I'm viewing this from a strictly legal perspective and wanting to be sure that you're not placing obligations upon yourself unless you want to, that you're not obligated to place upon yourselves by state law, and to also be sure that you're not placing yourselves in a position, and town council in a position, to be giving legal advice to individual citizens. I understand that the citizens are the citizens, they are the legislative body, but from a legal perspective, you are the town. My duty as town council is to the Board of Selectmen as the chief executive officials. We get this question often. Can any individual come and ask you, well, aren't I your boss? You work for me. I'm a resident of the town. Well, that's not what the law says. So I was looking at it strictly from that objective perspective and making the recommendation. So aside from changing the word will to may, and that's left to your discretion, if you want to remain, keep it as will, then so be it. After the term town meetings, where it says by acting, I removed the portion that suggested that the town manager would act as a conduit between town council, specifically where it then says with the legality and form of citizens petition articles. And I had said, again, speaking of the town manager, that the town manager may also seek the advice of town council relative to the form and substance of these petitions and their lawfulness and effect. So again, the town manager is still seeking the advice of council, or may seek the advice of council, and is still seeking that advice with respect to the effect that these petitions will have and whether or not they're lawful, but is not acting as a conduit between the individual for the purposes of getting legal advice.
So based on that, if town council asked you regarding the form and lawfulness, there's not a feedback loop to the citizen to provide the information of what town council would.
Well, there can certainly be a feedback loop, but it's not, the town manager is not a conduit between town council and the individual. In other words, the term conduit suggests that the advice is being given to the individual, but the town manager is just acting as the go-between. In this instance, it's the town manager that is seeking the advice of town council, and then certainly the expectation would be that that would be reported back to the citizen petitioner so that they can modify their petition accordingly.
See, I don't have a problem with it. Like, if there was a process set up, and I think it would be nice to define time, and Article 18 went through it, Article 18 may not have become an article if we could simply have told the citizen petitioner through a process like this, hey, there's not a clear title, we're not sure the town owns it, I think you almost prevent, now we have this article for town meeting that is asking for land we likely don't own. I think if we had a little bit of a process, it could streamline and clean up the situation that we need the answer to anyways. Here's a citizen petition article, and what did I ask tonight? I asked town council a question about a citizen petition article. So I don't think we can just eliminate citizen petition articles from the need of engaging with town council, even for our own benefit. So if we set up a process, and really when I researched citizen petition articles and taught it to myself, because Lunenburg doesn't help citizens work on things like this, it's so many, where I learned the information was from communities all over Massachusetts where they embrace the citizens' input and they're not afraid of it and they don't try to restrict it, but within reason. But I think putting a word like may and then giving one town employee the ability to help or not help sets you up for inconsistencies, and anybody who knows me knows I like when things are consistent, and everybody who approaches, regardless of what they approach on, should be given at least enough to I guess if you put may, then if it's something that somebody likes or somebody likes, they may help them. And then if Katie Adams shows up, they may not. And I don't like mays because I feel like it creates an unfair situation.
I have to fundamentally disagree with you because I, on the other hand, prefer discretion when it comes to people who are in charge of the town need to use their discretion about how to operate the town. I mean, that's their job. They need, and you're never, ever, ever going to be able to come up with a yes or no for every situation that's going to come at you. There's always a shade of gray. There's always one that's not this or that. And I just agree on the fundamentals that you need a will or a must on everything. I think it's up to discretion of the people who run this town.
I think the town manager, we entrust her to run the town. I think we can put the town manager may assist citizens interested in submitting citizens petitions and use the language that town council put forward. I trust the town manager.
But articles are like a part of the Constitution, and they're a little bit more important than going through one person. It's part of just the legislative process, and the town is the legislative body. Now, I'm not sure, I really liked Carl's citizen petition article, and I'm not sure he may have gotten help. And on the flip side, I've worked on stuff where I've been completely, rejected. And so I don't like may because I don't like people feeling like there's not a process where they're going to encounter the same outcome. I like a will, but then define what the will is. And we can be restrictive in the will, but then be respectfully restrictive to everybody and say, well, we will help. This is the part of the process we offer assistance on. Even if it's just understanding how to do it legally, you get it on there and then the town decides whether or not to say yes or no. But something like Article 18, it should be there, in my opinion, as an article that at least makes sense to have gone through a process of even, I guess I like a will and then restrict the will. I think everybody should encounter the same outcome when they're trying to participate.
So I will withdraw my motion that adopted this, and I would make a motion to come up with language as proposed by town council.
Second.
Any other discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
Okay. The next section, or section 4.01 for liquor license regulations. And I'm not sure, is everyone seeing the comments on this
What
that
were
are
the changes?
They're all balloon reference comments on the side of the document. So there's nothing until page 6.
The premises shall be lighted in all public areas in a manner sufficient for the safety of patients. Patrons, not patients. So this came up during one of the hearings for the property on Summer Street.
Showing funny, but that's it.
How do you get the comments? Oh, comments.
Yeah.
And maybe Adam can walk us through his comments where you had them.
It's on the side on the gray.
Didn't have comments on that one, right?
Oh, this where.
That's the only one.
lighting that was in the original.
So we had a liquor license hearing where they were challenging our bylaws weren't defining the lighting enough as opposed to the opinion of the police officer involved.
Right. Where is that? What number?
So 1.05, physical premises, subsection E. The premises shall be lighted in all public areas in a manner sufficient for the safety of patrons and in a manner sufficient for the agencies to make observation of the premises without the need to identify themselves.
Right.
So you look up input from Adam on 105E?
For the lighting. We also asked the police chief to be here tonight for his comments, and Elaine for any comments she may have dealing with the
Right.
liquor licensing on a frequent basis.
So, Mr. Chairman, if I may, so I think the only comment that Heather had on the liquor licensing policy was this one relative to lighting, and it wasn't addressed to me. I did see it. It didn't seem that there was anything legal here. It seemed that this was more a question of whether the board thought or thinks that it needs to expand the lighting requirements. I've seen liquor licensing regulations that don't address lighting at all, and I've seen some that go into great detail with lighting. But I don't have any specific guidance unless you'd like me to tell you what I've seen done in some other communities with respect to lighting. But
The issue occurred when we had a hearing, and the defense attorney, you have some input? Sure.
I do remember that, and the reference was to 1.08, section E. I'm sorry, F. She was challenging the 1-foot candle.
Oh, that's right, that's right. At all times, the public areas of licensed premises shall be continuously illuminated to the degree of not less than 1-foot candle measured 30 inches from the floor, except for those portions of the room under furniture. So it's a very technical question that the question was whether, one of the things we were challenging the liquor license holder on, whether they were properly lighting it so that the police officers could see things properly.
and was the suggestion that that sort of a provision is unlawful?
I don't think she used the term unlawful. I think it was not, you couldn't measure it by the police officer. So our challenge was couldn't be upheld based on how you measure this.
I mean, also, I guess, part of the issue was, is it all times, like even when they're closed at night, or all times when they're open? Because I think her argument where she was closed, why are my lights on? This just says at all times. And I guess, what is our intent with that?
You'd think it would need to be properly lit if there's people on the premises, somehow.
So this is the public areas of the licensed premises. So I guess the only concern we had was that we felt that since their attorney raised it during that hearing, it might be good to go back to that hearing minutes and actually see what the thing was and get that to town council.
I think the reference was to the 1-foot candle measurement. She challenged that amount of light as being adequate or inadequate. I can't recall, but I do remember her saying in other, I think it was in Fitchburg, she was on the licensing commission, and that they had a different measurement for the light, and this was not adequate. I can't remember exactly because it was way back in June of last year. So I'd have to go back to read those minutes.
So this is a challenge that exists, and you've seen it elsewhere with any bylaw that addresses things like lighting, noise. I recognize you don't have a bylaw before you, it's a policy, but we'll soon be discussing a noise bylaw. There are two ways to regulate these sorts of things. You can regulate them qualitatively and you can regulate them quantitatively, or you can do both. Both have their pros, or each has its own pros and cons. When you regulate qualitatively, you give yourself, it's a more subjective standard, so you give yourself some discretion. It's the quality of the noise that is being regulated. When you regulate quantitatively, you have a more objective standard. In noise, it's decibels or decibels above ambient. In lighting, it tends to be foot candles. The challenge there is, do you have the resources or the mechanism to complete the measurement and to then determine that there's been a violation and to enforce the violation in a manner that will be upheld on appeal? And that's a challenge in the noise context. It's a challenge in the lighting context. It's a challenge in some other contexts. So I would say that what I see more often, at least in this sort of simpler context of a policy that deals with liquor licensing and a concern for safety, is a more subjective, qualitative standard where it's not citing to 1 foot candle necessarily, but it's stating that the lighting shall be sufficient to ensure the public safety at all times, at all locations on the premises, whenever the premises is open to the public or whenever there are occupants present, something like that. Gives you greater discretion to determine that the lighting is or is not sufficient. You still need someone to make the judgment call. It's still subject to challenge. It always will be. But you don't have to get a lighting expert out there with some sort of a light meter to determine where, holding it 30 inches above the ground, whether the measurement is 1 foot candle here, whether it's 1 foot candle over there, whether it's 1 foot candle over there. That can be difficult to do.
I think going with something generic, like should be sufficiently lit for safety, was on my mind, and also in the applying it to the circumstance of which it came out of. They lost their liquor license anyways, so I don't think it came down to a lit bar or an unlit bar. So I think it's nice to define that it should be lit for safety, but I don't think that's ever going to decide a license. So I don't think we need to probably worry too much.
Although it could be one of the things they violate and that it tips them over into a suspension.
Right, but I think I think it's always going to be hard to define it, whether it's that we can't define the candle or we can't define who defines sufficient. I mean, I think it needs to be in there, but I don't think it's going to be a determining factor. It certainly wasn't with this license.
There's got to be an app for that.
The candle width.
I was trying to look it up to see all the different things, and you get all
And
these.
like Damon said, they were closed anyways, and so it became an issue that they shouldn't have been open lights on or lights off.
But if you remember, the defense attorney was using the argument that we weren't following our own bylaws, and as a result, the officer wasn't able to determine or didn't have probable cause, or she was using it as a kind of a stepping stone that said, our bylaws were insufficient to give him what he needed for us to consider, for us to consider his testimony valid. I don't think she was questioning candlelight numbers. She was just saying you have things in there that you're not even measuring, and how can you tell that he was able to tell whether there were patrons in the bar or not in the bar, or probable cause to ask? And she was really attacking asserting that our regulations in general were ambiguous, and therefore we didn't have the authority to have the hearing or have the hearing on those points.
Did the police officer charge them with violation of that section? Do you remember?
No.
Okay.
But he was talking about patrons in the place when it was, what he could see through the closed window, if you recall, and why he.
And I think he was trying to read IDs.
Right.
The other option would be to do sort of an either or, and that's the approach that we took in the noise bylaw. So rather than opt for either the quantitative or the qualitative standard, you give yourself the ability to use either. So say something like, at all times the public areas of the licensed premises must be continuously illuminated to the degree of not less than 1 foot candle measured 30 inches from the floor, or as otherwise necessary to ensure the public safety, except those portions of the room under furniture, or something to that effect. So you're giving yourself the ability to take the foot candle measurement if you still think that's an appropriate measurement. And I can't speak to what 1 foot candle 30 inches from the floor is. I don't know. But you give yourself either standard to abide by.
Sounds like that covers all bases.
I guess one of the reasons that I wanted us to look at our our alcohol-related bylaws was just to ensure, and I certainly don't want to become an expert on candlefoots, but, you know, are all of our bylaws within reason vis-à-vis other towns or the legal statutes to be able to defend them when a real occurrence happens, you know, when somebody's in the bar that shouldn't be in the bar, or an officer is looking to check identification or proof of age or something like that. So I'd take it up a level and say, I don't really have a preference whether we're quantitative or qualitative. It's just, are our bylaws sufficient to allow us to enforce our duties as the liquor regulators?
So I think the answer is yes. I mean, I've seen all sorts of different liquor licensing policies, guidelines. I've seen the most simplistic page. I've seen guidelines that are booklets in some communities. So yours is somewhere in between the two. I think you've got enough substance here. Could you simplify certain provisions? Probably. Could you add a whole lot more substance, as some communities choose to do? Sure. You know, where's the sweet spot and what's appropriate for Lunenburg? That's really for you to decide. But, you know, I didn't go through and sort of nitpick. I gave it a read. Nothing jumped out at me as being, you know, immediately contrary to state law. But if you want recommendations or me to provide a more sort of section by section narrative approach of what other communities have done here or there, I'm certainly happy to provide that.
Go ahead.
The other question I would ask would be ask the chief to find out whether the police officers who are licensing agents, whether they feel supported enough and they understand the language, or whether the review might be useful.
I just want to make sure it's doing what we intended to do, too. I mean, just the lighting itself, it's mentioned at least 3 times in here. It's also it's twice in 1.05, too, in addition to 108, and it's all talking about lighting in a different manner. So again, what are these trying to accomplish? How are they helping keep people safe? And how can we help the police enforce them is what I'm interested in. And if it's not doing any of those, why is it there?
Right.
Yeah, if you have, you know, what has been your experience with review of our liquor license policies?
Well, with respect to the lighting issue, I think that under the general law, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Adam, the windows can't be obscured. We have to be able to walk up to a window and be able to see inside the building, which gets into the whole lighting issue. We have to be able to see what's going on in the building. When we go on in the building, we have to be able to see you know, at some reasonable level, what's going on. And I think there was some mention of somebody trying to read a license or whatever. I think it's fair to say that we should be able to read a license without the assistance of a flashlight inside of a building like that while they're serving alcoholic beverages. So that's something I don't have the bylaw with me, so I don't remember exactly what the language is in there, but that's something to consider anyway. That to us is very important when we're entering a licensed premise. Other than that, I can't think of any other thing over the last how many years I've been here that I've had an issue with respect to licensing of alcohol, premises that serve alcohol. I would say though, just to emphasize the windows being blocked, we've had issues with that. They'll put signs in the window and try to obscure the window. Well, I don't think you want to purpose, probably not, I shouldn't say that. Probably no intent, but they do that, and we've had to address those issues.
And yet that's covered. Under H, I'm just looking at here.
It's covered in the bylaw, right?
Yeah.
So some of our review was also just to get ourselves aware of what's in here when we actually have a liquor license violation, so that, you know, we generally understand what's going on when they come before us. And with I think some of the discussion we had is that when do you do the warning, when do you do the 3 days, 1 week, 2 week, complete suspension, revocation, things like that. Some towns, when near the Lowell area, when people were, they did this sting with the underage people getting the alcohol, all of them were given 3-day suspensions, whereas we gave a warning. That's our discretion, that type of thing. So it's a little bit like, well, what in here do we really think is really important? And I'm not proposing to change any language or anything, but so I guess it would be good if town council did a cursory review with the police chief of what things might be changed, and then come back to us for what you think. Because if it's working, and other than the language of clarifying the light, and I like the fact that the ability to read a driver's license without the use of a flashlight is a pretty clear indication that you'd be able to say, as opposed to candle power, you know, maybe do the candle power, the reasonable safety, and then the ability to read a license or something like that, that an average person is going to understand, you know, it can't be dark. Without bifocals.
You know, you just reminded me, I think that in the course of, these were two different requests when we were putting the agenda together. One was for us to understand our role in the whole liquor review and liquor hearings, and another was to look at our bylaws. And I think we're in looking at the bylaws mode tonight.
Yep.
When we originally put this on the agenda, I think you're right. I think it was more for us to get comfortable with what are the important parts of the bylaws, what make the most sense for us to be very serious about it. And we're serious about all of it, but you know, which ones are we very serious about, et cetera.
So if it satisfies the board, I can complete a more extensive review of what we have. To the extent that I see anything that could be modified or that presents options, I can annotate the document accordingly, and I can get it to the police chief. He can give it a review. If he's got any comments, we can have a conversation if need be, and then get it back to the board with some feedback.
I think that'd be fine. And there was nothing in your review at this point that we need to act on right away?
Nothing that needs to be acted on right away. No.
Okay. Fine. Great. Now, does that include 402 and 403? Or do we need to talk about them?
No, I think we do. 402, the BYOB regulations.
Right.
So Heather asked me specifically to look more closely at these.
Okay.
And so I did that, and I did a section-by-section review in light of some others that I've reviewed previously.
Okay.
And your BYOB regulations, I suspect they are in many respects nearly identical to what I've got in 2 or 3 other communities. So I'm guessing that you've all borrowed off the same sample, maybe.
Okay.
Which is good that they're consistent and they're what other towns are using as well. So you can see my comments along the margin. Let me highlight the ones that maybe require brief discussion. So a question that Heather had, or maybe that one or some of you had, is whether there would be a carry-in requirement for a place like Shady Point or some other locale that isn't a restaurant. And you know, the easy answer to that in some respects is no, based on how you've currently got this drafted. The harder answer is, you know, I think it's no, really, no matter how you draft it, because I think that I've not found another community that has regulated alcoholic beverages or intoxicating beverages except in connection with common vic licenses. Mm-hmm. It's the common vic license that's used as a trigger and as the basis for the town to say, if you also want to provide BYOB as an option, we're going to adopt regulations that address that. I've not found any community that has regulated the consumption of alcoholic beverages brought for personal consumption onto essentially what is private property, even if it's private property that in some respects is open to the public, like a campground where you can pay and you can get on and you can utilize it. There's a fine line here between exercise of the police power and regulation, and then impinging upon, you know, rights on private property. Nobody's going to come into your house and tell you you can't have a beer on your back deck. I understand that obviously it's a much more extensive version of that when you're dealing with a campground, but if it's the campground that doesn't have a common vic license, I've not found any basis in the law to allow you to somehow regulate BYOB on that property.
You may want to look at, I think the city of Fitchburg is doing this, so they just did a hearing because I believe there was a question of the bowling alley may no longer be able to have BYOB, and they don't have a common victualler. They may have, I don't know what permits they would have other than automatic amusement device or something else like that.
Okay, but they've had they currently do have BYOB, but they may be restricted or
Right,
maybe.
it was in the headlines over the last 2 weeks.
It was, and it also talked about, so there's other places that do sip and paint type
Oh,
of.
that's right, that's right.
event.
yeah.
Well, I was thinking when I was looking at these, it seemed to me the focus was you can't bring your own booze, beer. If you want people to bring their own liquor, then you have to be serving them food. So that's why, that was the common vic connection.
Yeah.
You can't let people bring in their own beer if you're not serving food, so you have to serve food. So it feels like it's a sort of a double-edged sword. Yes, it's in connection with a common vic license, because the assumption is if you're letting people bring their own booze, you're providing them with food. And so this is a case, sometimes there are cases where you're not providing food and you're allowing people to bring their own liquor and you're not regulating. So that seems like there's a gigantic hole there.
Well, I'll further research the issue again. I'll look and see what Fitchburg has done. I reviewed, what we've done in a number of communities, but I looked certainly beyond our communities to see what's been done elsewhere. I had an associate of mine do the same thing. We didn't come up with communities that are regulating alcoholic beverages outside of the common vic context. Maybe we'll find something. I recognize that there are some instances where you've got these sip and paint type operations, but what we found in those instances, and again, maybe there are some exceptions to this, is that some of those fall under the liquor licensing scheme because there are separate sections within Chapter 138 that provide for these short-term licenses or one-day licenses. They're not
Often at
BYOB.
restaurants also, right? Aren't they sometimes?
No.
Right, and you've got wineries that provide these. So, I mean, these sorts of events do exist, but sometimes they're within the licensing statute. So it's this sort of gray area between you're not falling under Chapter 138. You don't have a liquor license of any sort, even a one-day license or a special event license, but you're also not BYOB in the common vic context. So once you get into this gray area, then you have to be careful that you're not impinging upon private rights. So I understand you say, well, the presumption is that if you're bringing alcoholic beverages, bringing your own, then the establishment you're going to is going to be serving food. But what if they're not? Well, okay, but is it a facility that's open to the public? Is it, because I can bring alcoholic beverages, I can bring a six-pack over to a friend's house and have a beer in the backyard, and the town can't tell me that I can't do that. But if it's open to the public in some respect, does that then open it up to public regulation?
Right.
That's
And
the issue.
this is open to the public.
I think the assumption was on the BYOB was it was focused on the common victualler so that you didn't circumvent the liquor license law and allow people to drink there, and therefore you have the possibility of people getting drunk and causing problems on the road, that type of a thing, as opposed to just regulating the activity. So I think that's why it was always focused towards the food, and I don't think anybody ever thought about alcohol at non-food places, because most places wouldn't do that until the sip and paint or the bowling alley or some other thing that you may have out there. So I think it'd be good to find out what other places are doing, and Fitchburg hasn't adopted it yet, so it's just regulation. I mean, it's just proposed regulation.
Okay. So my next comment, or the next one that warrants some discussion, is Section 2, and I'm still within 4.02, so Section 2, General Rules. And my only comment here was that I didn't see in the policy, and I don't know if you have it in some form of a separate document or not, any real guidance with regard to when and how an application gets made, what fees are assessed to process the application, the process that follows, notice, public hearing, opportunity to be heard, things like that in the BYOB context. And I think that if you're adopting a policy to provide for some form of a process, you need to have better guidelines. And again, I don't know that those necessarily need to be in the policy. Sometimes those are just in a separate handout of some sort. But I do think it makes sense to provide some guidance to an applicant as to what can be expected.
So to pull over the same procedure that we have on the other liquor license in there. Yeah,
Right.
makes sense.
So section 3, subsection C, and this ties into a comment I made up above in the definition of restaurant. Many communities, and again, I looked at a number of policies or bylaws that were crafted just like this, probably off of the same form. Some of them exempted from the definition of restaurant, fast food restaurants. You didn't do that in the definition, but then you do have a provision here that says no carry-in permit shall be issued to any fast food restaurant. I've had a couple of cases that have turned on the definition of fast food restaurant, not in the liquor licensing context or in the BYOB context, but in the zoning context, where municipalities haven't defined what a fast food restaurant is. Where do you draw the line between fast food in these days where you've got, quick food to go? I mean, Applebee's has a, park here and will come out to your car with the food. Is Panera fast food, or is it slow food cooked fast? It's so I think that there's a little bit of a gray area here. So most municipalities in the zoning context have opted to try to define this term so that it's clear what they mean. So I just made a recommendation. I gave you one example from a reference book that I have that gives zoning definitions, but there are probably a dozen others you could find by looking at other municipalities' bylaws and seeing what they've chosen to do. But there's one example there in the.
And I guess I would question is that why are we prohibiting a fast food restaurant from having a BYOB? Do we have any fast food restaurants in Lunenburg?
No.
Under the traditional McDonald's type thing? I guess I'd be interested to see why. I mean, would we give a liquor license to a McDonald's? If you were in France, you would, because.
A carry-in or a liquor
For
license?
a regular liquor license, let's go on the regular part. If they wanted to come for a liquor license, could we do it? And if we did, why would you do a BYOB? I mean, and I don't have any, since we don't have any fast food places at the moment, but
Would you maybe think like a Dippin' Donuts is a little bit like fast food?
yeah, it probably
And it
is.
functions like a McDonald's.
Yeah.
It's just a muffin
Well, yeah,
instead of
you
a
get a-
burger.
Muffin and a beer.
At the
Irish
drive-through?
coffee, there you go.
No. You know what?
So,
Fast
I mean,
food.
I guess, I mean, there
I
must
just
have been
thought of
some reason.
something. Fast food is usually, should it say drive-through? I mean, are
Drive-through.
we trying to say no liquor at a drive-through restaurant?
No, 'cause
That feels
we
right.
have very specific rules against drive-throughs.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't propose change anything at the moment, but I'd just be interested, as you're looking at different things, if you can find out why somebody did that, that'd be good to know.
Sure. Okay, so down in section G, I'm still on item 3. The board may refuse to grant carry-in permit in certain geographical areas of the town where the character of the neighborhood may warrant such a refusal, or when not allowed as a permitted use under a special permit or zoning bylaw. So I guess I just had a question here, and my comment, I just had to read it 2 or 3 times myself. Here's what I was saying. When what is not allowed as a permitted use? I'm a little confused as to what is being said here exactly. So the board may refuse to grant the permit, or the character of the neighborhood may warrant refusal, or when the permit is not allowed as a permitted use, or the underlying use for which the carry-in permit is granted is not allowed. In which case, so you're saying that you can refuse to grant the carry-in permit to essentially grandfathered uses? Because a use is either going to be a use that's allowed by the zoning bylaw or allowed by a special permit. Otherwise, it's prohibited, and you should be stopping the use altogether, not just refusing them a BYOB carry-in permit. So that was my comment there.
Should we just eliminate G?
Since it's a common victular license, I mean, I don't know why you do a geographical decision as
Right,
opposed
right.
to, it may have come from some community that, but doesn't make sense here.
Right, because it,
But they may give, yeah.
But if if the use is permitted for it to be a restaurant
Yeah.
already,
Could it be something near a school or something like that?
That wouldn't be a geographical area, that would be within,
Mm-hmm.
and that's,
it's probably prohibited already, isn't it?
No, it's up to us.
but on the regular liquor license, is there a limit of liquor licenses within so many feet of a school or a church?
Yeah, but this could be a restaurant near a church or a school, and they're looking for a carry-in permit.
Right.
They don't have a liquor license, but they're looking for a carry-in permit.
But that still wouldn't be a geographical area. Geographical is like the
Yeah,
north end, it's
yeah.
not within, that would say something. So, I mean, I think anything that we can't defend,
Right.
we should try to find out why another town put it in there, you know, for the reason, to see maybe that applies for us, but if we can't defend it, it shouldn't be in there.
Mhm.
I just have a note next to section 4. Many of the other versions I saw, you've got A, B, C, and D, had, A through G or A through M. There were a number of additional obligations placed on a common vic that's being granted a carry-in permit. So some of them didn't apply in Lunenburg, and I was able to determine that, but a few that I saw with some consistency in other communities, a requirement to order and consume food on the premises, which I guess is sort of part and parcel with a common vic. Restrictions on the uncorking, pouring, and sealing by the common vics. So are they permitted to perform those activities or not? And the requirement of mandatory employee training, which was something I saw elsewhere. I think you have somewhere a reference here to tips. And I forget exactly what you say. I don't think you require it. I think you recommend it.
Oh, it's recommended.
That was my recollection.
So it's a may.
Right, the very first.
Oh, right, the very first sentence,
Yeah.
right. So it's a recommendation. So again, some communities had mandatory employee training, not necessarily saying it has to be tips, but some form of training as to, how to determine when an individual shouldn't be drinking anymore.
Doesn't the Board of Health require that employees take training before they come into a common vic license?
No,
I don't think,
only
not for
related
any
to alcohol.
common vic, right?
Somebody does, because no other restaurant wants to know about tip training just by virtue of having a license. And there's no order.
A vic license or a liquor license?
Vic license.
Really?
Huh. I don't think we have that in our victual license, no.
I thought it was a Board of Health.
Food safe, like a,
Food safety
Yeah.
training, maybe, not tips.
We had tips training.
Huh.
Yeah, food safety training and tips training.
But then it goes to the common victualler should not permit any person under the age of 21 to consume intoxicating beverages. So we are starting to say, all right, you don't have a liquor license, but you have to act as if you are because you've got a BYOB.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah, you would think that they wouldn't need training if they're allowing liquor to be brought in.
But-
Actually, come to think of it, we were doing wine tasting, I think we did it all, the food training officer, maybe, I think back then there was no policy, so the selectmen allowed us to do it. I think we did it all.
Mhm.
So that's just my commentary on 4. 4B, I just have a comment here because I've seen this arise in other communities. Outdoor seating areas.
All right.
I don't know if you have that with any of your restaurants with common vics where they've got, an area along the side or out back where they've got, an enclosed, semi-enclosed, fenced-in area that they've got, anywhere from 2 to 10 tables out there that's part of their restaurant and their license extends to it. That's part of their seating area. The way that this currently reads, the common vic shall only allow intoxicating beverages to be consumed in the dining room or dining rooms of the restaurant. It should be expanded to include outdoor seating areas that are, part and parcel of the establishment.
So I think on Ember's Pizza was the discussion we had is that they actually came up with a plan as what is the outside seating limits? And did they have some way to restrict people from carrying the drinks beyond?
You know, they have it, it is fenced in, and the only way you can get in and out is through the restaurant. But they do serve at the outdoor seating area, and I would assume that they would allow, if they had a BYOB, which they
Instead
don't.
of dining rooms, can't you just say dining areas?
Sure.
Yeah, dining areas.
And then you're
Yeah.
dining.
And you don't actually need a fence, from my experience. It needs to be a designated area. It can be a planter, it can be
Right.
a string or chain, but it doesn't need to be a physical barrier.
Yeah, you can just have a sign.
Or the edge of the patio. I mean,
So two more comments. Section 6, this deals with penalties. I've made just a clarification to the first paragraph that I think improves the definition of what a violation is and how to define single versus multiple violations and violations by the same customer arising out of the same event or separate offenses, etc. And then I have a comment here in that same section about the second paragraph, which is something that I didn't see in any of the other samples that I found or that we've used in other communities, which is an attempt to penalize not the common vic, not the recipient of the carry-in permit, which of course is what this entire policy deals with, but the person bringing the intoxicating beverages into or consuming the beverages in the restaurant. So I wasn't quite sure about the enforceability of those sorts of penalties in a policy that originates from regulating the common vic. It's the obligation, the responsibility of the common vic to be sure that people are complying. If people aren't complying, I'm not sure that you'd have success enforcing this bylaw against a patron.
So in a regular liquor license,
Yeah.
can we enforce these or not?
In a regular liquor license, you can because there's statutory authority for it. So that's my concern there. If I'm going to take a closer look at this and get you answer some of your other questions, I can further research that as well.
We should find out.
But I didn't see it elsewhere, so it caused me to take some pause. And then in section 7, you've got a provision here that authorizes you to suspend, modify, cancel, deny, refuse to renew, or revoke a common vic license in the event that the common vic has committed multiple willful or repeated violations. So that's an important provision because that's what gives you the authority. And I just wondered whether you want to restrict yourselves to willful. What about a common vic that is just being, repeatedly negligent in performing its obligations? That may not be willful. Willful's a different standard legally than negligent. Maybe negligence too low of a standard. Maybe it's grossly negligent. That's another term that's used. But I think giving yourself greater flexibility here, not just for willful or repeated violations, but for a common vic that's being negligent or, at the very least, grossly negligent, to be able to enforce against them makes some sense.
Yep.
I agree with that.
And that's all I had on that section.
Just back up to the one on the enforceability. If it's enforceable by statute, refusing to show valid ID, et cetera, wouldn't it be enforceable by statute, whether it was a liquor license or a BYOB?
But it's not a statute to require you to give it.
I'm just saying, we're saying it's a $300 fine or something, if someone refuses to give their ID to a police officer or refusing to allow.
But I don't think that's illegal on the street.
Yeah, I mean, that was my only concern, that
Okay.
because
Yeah, well,
in the
look
liquor
at the
licensing
review.
context,
Okay.
it's made legitimate, but I'm just not, there's no statute that deals with BYOB. You're just exercising your police power, essentially.
Right, okay.
Which is fine, but I just had some concern. Worst case, I'm not necessarily advising you take it out. You just have to be mindful that if you choose to enforce it, it may be subject to challenge.
Right.
Let's make sure we can legally do it. And if it's not in this, let's refer to the statute where it's allowed. Then there's a referral in there.
It's fine.
Common sense would tell you if liquor's being enjoyed, the same rules should apply. But common sense doesn't necessarily rule the day.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
So that's all I had to 402, and I didn't have any changes to 403.
Okay.
Great.
If you attempt to purchase, but this is BYOB, so nobody's purchasing. That's the problem.
Yeah. Okay, so we're not taking any action on the liquor ones this evening. Okay, for 17.
Taxi cabs.
So if I could, so Heather had a question, is anybody regulating Uber and Lyft? They would like to, but they're not. The reason is because in late 2016, Massachusetts decided to sort of get ahead of this and regulate this at the state level. And in doing so, they specifically issued a statute that prohibited municipalities from regulating it. They preempted the field by virtue of them regulating it. So Chapter 187 of the Acts of 2016, I think it's comprised of maybe 14 sections, provides for sort of comprehensive regulation of these, what they call transportation network companies is the term they've chosen to use. And so they say, and I've quoted it here in the remark, except where expressly set forth in this chapter, no municipality or other local or state entity, except the Massachusetts Port Authority, may require any additional license for a transportation network company or a transportation network driver, or subject the transportation network company to the municipality's requirements, including but not limited to entry or operational requirements. So, short answer is you can't.
They didn't want to do us a solid and just include taxis and limos in there too.
So the question that I had is that we have one limousine license. And the question becomes whether, I think, do we do Corey of the owner?
Yes.
But the question becomes if the owner has different drivers, whether those have to be Coreyed.
Since I've been here, I've quarried all the drivers.
All the drivers of the limousine company. Okay, great. Thank you.
I just did it naturally. I didn't
Okay.
Adam, what did they call the companies, the transportation network?
They're called transportation network companies.
And what would prohibit a limousine company from saying they're one of those? How do they define themselves? And that anybody could say, "But you can't regulate me because I'm one of those and therefore under this state statute."
Right, so I didn't put in here, and I can pull for you, I can probably do it right now, the definition of transportation network companies, but they've defined it because they've got to distinguish between those and then their state statute that deal with taxi cab companies, which is separate and apart. But let me pull the definition.
I was just curious how somebody who owns a different type of transportation company wouldn't try to define themselves as one of those transportation network companies and then circumvent any local rules.
Right.
Okay.
And the other thing that always gets me is, and I'm not sure there's a way around it, but this kind of talks to taxis or limousines that their principal place of business is in Lunenburg, but it doesn't regulate people coming, having an establishment in Fitchburg or Leominster and picking up and dropping off people in our town. So Corey, et cetera, would be the responsibility of someplace else.
We probably ought to investigate what Fitchburg and Leominster does for their cabs, just to have an idea.
Or any other town,
So a transportation network company is defined by the Act as a corporation, partnership, sole proprietorship, or other entity that uses a digital network to connect riders to drivers to prearrange and provide transportation.
Okay.
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 5.01 poll petition?
Do we want to do anything with taxi cab, or leave that one as well?
We can't.
Okay.
Well, I mean, the part, right, that Heather's question, the answer was we can't.
You can't do anything with respect to Uber and Lyft, right, to try to incorporate them into the taxi cab, right? You can't establish a licensing scheme that would apply to them.
We do have a taxi and limousine one.
Yes, that's fine.
And we're not, okay. It exists and we're not changing it, is what you're telling me?
Right.
Okay, fair enough. Poll petitions.
So I'm on a roll here telling you what you
Go for
can't
it.
do.
Nice and fast.
So this has been the subject of quite a bit of discussion in a number of communities because these double polls are they're not very aesthetically pleasing and they're annoying to many communities, and they've wanted to do what they can do to prohibit them, but they can't. So you can see here, I've said in the comment acknowledging that, quote, the presence of double pole sets for prolonged periods while attachments are transferred from the old to the new pole present aesthetic and safety concerns, and further conceding that General Laws, Chapter 164, Section 34B, in fact, places a 90-day limit on the utility pole replacement process. The Supreme Judicial Court decided in 2005 that although there's no express legislative intent to forbid local activity regarding double pole removal, the comprehensive nature of the statute implies that the legislature intended to preempt municipalities from enacting legislation. So another instance where the court has determined that the statute is broad enough to essentially occupy the field and preempt municipalities from doing anything to regulate double poles. It's entirely governed by statute. And unfortunately, the statute provides a 90-day time limit that has not been enforced by the state. And they've acknowledged they've not enforced it and that it's difficult to enforce, and they've been making some progress of late. There's been some legislation introduced that really hasn't gotten any traction, but they've been making some progress establishing, for example, a list, at least in some communities, of the numbers of double poles, trying to create sort of an online inventory so that they can try to get ahead of it. But I mean, they're going to be chasing their tails, I think, for a long time on this one, because there are a lot of them.
And it's usually, so utility companies as well, they can't remove the double pole until all the secondary networks are off, the internet and phone lines are removed. And those utility companies are even harder to get to transfer those lines.
Right. And so they remove things sequentially, and my understanding of the process is that they need to do it in a particular sequence for safety purposes.
Yes.
And so they come in and do it sequentially, and then they never get back around to coming and removing either the last few items or removing the pole once the items are all off it. So anyway.
Would this prohibit the board from, say, if there was a poll petition for holding up the process to address other double poles within the town?
What do you mean by holding up the process?
Meaning not granting
New polls?
the request of the poll
A
petition?
new pole because of a double pole somewhere else.
Right.
Feels like a tit for tat.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be concerned. I've run into this not in the double poll context, but in other areas where either the courts or the legislature has determined that the legislature has occupied the field. Building code is a good example. I had a case a number of years back in another municipality where they had a bylaw on the books that required 5-foot fences around pools. The building code requires 4-foot fences. They said, we like our 5-foot fence requirement. Somebody challenged them, and I had to go to the Building Code Appeals Board and argue that the town has a more stringent requirement. Why do you care if it's more stringent? Your standard is 4 feet because the state believes that protects public safety. I lost. They said, we occupy the field. We preempt you. You can't regulate fence height around pools at all. We don't care whether you say 10 feet. Doesn't matter. We say 4 feet, and 4 feet's enough. So my guess is in that circumstance, if you really got challenged, if the applicant was denied a poll petition and they challenged it, the court would cite to the Boston Edison case and say, you don't have any ability to even hold them hostage on the basis that they have to do something that you can't require them to do because only the legislature can. Doesn't say you can't, doesn't mean you can't ask for it, doesn't mean you can't use it as leverage. But legally, I wouldn't wouldn't die on that hill.
Hey, Chief.
Thank you.
Thank you.
5.02.
5.02, you can see my revisions here, red line throughout. Just to clarify, Heather's question to me was whether it abides by state law. It generally does, but I was a bit concerned by some of the terminology. I tried to mimic the statutes, but also provide for some flexibility with language. So for example, the statutes refer to it as a public way. You call it I've seen it referred to as a townway. You call it a public townway, which was sort of interesting. So I've just clarified it here that it's a public, also known as a townway. Spoken about the selectmen conducting a layout hearing. Some of these provisions you've got here are optional, but I don't disagree that they make good sense. So, copy of the complete application being sent to the planning board and the DPW for recommendations. That's not in the statute, but that seems to make sense. Same thing with respect to notification of the selectmen's layout hearing being posted in a newspaper at least 7 days before the hearing. That's not a requirement of the statute either, but that's okay. Let me just make sure I'm capturing the answers I had to Heather's comments. So she asked, isn't it a requirement to vote to lay out the road at a public meeting and then it can be voted at town meeting? And I said, yes, but the policy is correct insofar as it references the layout only. That's what's within the selectmen's purview. The road acceptance requires a town meeting vote. So it's sort of it's a multi-step process. The selectmen hold the layout hearing, they vote to lay out the road, and then town meeting accepts it.
I would make a motion, we change 5.02 road acceptance as provided by town council.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Coming down the home stretch.
So the social media policy is 7.10. This is obviously a substantial one. I'll address it, although I didn't make section by section comments purposely so. And so I'll defer to Heather in a minute, but essentially what, my position is this social media policy, I had an associate of mine review it because she's done these for a number of our communities. In fact, one of the examples that Heather sent as something she thought made some sense for Lunenburg to review is something that one of my associates had drafted for one of our other communities. What she came back with is this is sufficient. There's nothing in here that runs afoul of state law. But like anything, you can get far more specific or far more comprehensive, or you could do something far simpler. And so you'll see, what I said here, that one question Heather had asked was about applying the social media policy to elected and appointed officials. That's something that the town of Easton has done in their policy, which Sarah in my office had drafted. So we agree that makes some sense because it gives those who appear before boards and commissions and these officials a sense that they're receiving a fair hearing because there's not chatter going on in the background via social media amongst these board members. And we certainly have other examples that we can share with the board, with Heather, to bulk this up a bit if you think it makes sense to try to make it more specific, make it more comprehensive, and find a way to address public officials whether they be elected or appointed, as specifically called out in the policy, which it doesn't currently do.
So I guess the first question is that. Are we talking about employees, or are we talking about employees including elected and appointed officials when we go through this?
Aren't they appointed and elected officials and employees?
That's what I was going to comment. In the broad sense, employees refers to both, but I don't think it would hurt to identify and define the difference and have a section if there's any things that are more applicable to a board and committee versus a paid town employee, that we could.
I'm sure most
amend this
people, most
policy.
volunteers don't think they're employees of the town, but in the real sense they are.
Yeah. So part of the question becomes if there was, I'm going to go to an egregious violation of this, not just a simple one, by a appointed member of a committee that we appoint, theoretically, we could remove them for cause as a result of that under the town charter and the bylaws, as opposed to an employee who could be fired for an egregious violation through the normal performance.
Right, and one of the issues, so there's a policy that we're working on in the town of Newbury, and it's still a working draft, and I'd offered to share it with Heather and obviously with the board. It's a public document. But one thing that they're contemplating now, which is why it's still a working draft, is whether they try and separate out within the policy the different types of employees or special employees because of the fact that in some ways they can be treated the same, but in some other ways they have to be treated differently. And reprimand would be one example of how they would need to be treated differently depending upon how they came to their post, whether they're elected or appointed. So that's one approach.
Yeah, it may be valuable because I remember when Phyllis and I both went to that workshop on social media at MMA a couple of years ago, that the whole concept of elected officials, you almost want to have a separate policy there because you are under a slightly different rule, that type of thing, because you can't be fired. I mean, unless it's except for through the recall type of thing, and that's a different discussion. But I guess I think it'd really be good for anyone who's serving the town to know what standards they're going to be held at. And if we need to define it either in the definition or we need to have a separate section, do we give it to the people we appointed tonight, the cultural council? You're considered an employee for the purposes of this policy and everything else in the, it's not just this policy, there's other policies, the anti-discrimination, the other policies that we have that everybody's considered that. So we ought to think about it not just for this policy, but how does it fit with all the other policies?
And I think it's very gray. I read the examples, and right away, I don't know if it was the Oxford example or not, but they say that they're really defining the difference between posting on town-sanctioned sites and separating it from personal life and personal sites. That's not really well defined here. And the example, when they kept using the same word. Let me just go back to it here if I can. The document outlines the policies and procedures for the town use of their social media sites. And I mean, there's a couple different things. The police department has a site, the DPW has a site, the town has a site, and then we all have our own Facebook page. I mean, you think you really want to define the policy as it applies to your use and communication in one place versus another. And they did do that. And then I think it's just our policy reads very gray, especially now where there's so many different types of media and they're not all bad. The other example I read, they define laws, because if you put in there public records laws, open meeting laws, you start to sort of define just based on calling out the laws what appropriate use is. And we're all restricted by those anyways. And then there may be in town like anti-bullying policies we already have. Apply that to the social media policy per your use of town sites. And it just feels like an empty policy because it says a lot without defining much.
And then the part where it's employees' personal use of social media sites at work. So you have an appointed committee member who's considered an employee. Can they not use the social media when they're at their committee meeting? So that's effectively what that prohibits.
Or like the police department does social media, like they do great
At
posts
work.
like the bear, or
Right.
this happened, or the school puts out a lot. Social media is very effectively used to communicate now in a way that's positive.
But in that case, it's not a personal use of social media, that's actually professional. So I think there is a value to split out use of town sites versus and what are the limits there versus use of non-town sites and what you can and can't do there.
I think it's really interesting to think about employees using social media sites while they're at a meeting. I would think that you couldn't do that because that's when you're working.
But I'm talking about an appointed member of, like, the cultural council. So they're at the meeting and said, we're having a great meeting, and you post it on Facebook.
They might make an event while they're there, like
Yeah.
let's post our
So-
event
so
and
they're actually
create some
using it.
content.
And
But
using
that
it,
wouldn't be personal use. We're talking about, if they're talking about a cultural council event, then that wouldn't be personal use. If you make a personal statement using social media while you're at a meeting, I would think that would be wrong.
or during the meeting and they're bored because of a presentation, they decide to post on their own Facebook page.
Right.
But a lot of people do communicate, use Facebook Messenger, check if bedtime went okay. I mean, you're starting to really be extremely invasive if people are restricted from taking a phone call then during a meeting. Somebody got up and left with well, sometimes there's emergencies, there's children. You got to make sure a policy's not affecting people's ability to exist. I mean, right now, if I got a phone call from a babysitter, I'm going to go take it. And I don't think there should be a policy that I can't.
And so that's, in fact, one of the few comments that we had on this, which was, as I said, it's generally fine, but you've got a zero tolerance policy here, and that's fine and ideal in some respects, but I think you have to recognize, number one, that there are exceptions, and number two, that people are going to violate it. And it's the nature of this day and age. Everybody has a cell phone on their hip or in front of them, and they can't help it. They're looking down. They're on Facebook while they're at their meeting or whatnot. So does it make some sense to try to place some limitations on it as opposed to just adopting a zero tolerance policy that is going to be, from the day you adopt it, going to be violated? Some exceptions, recognizing that sort of insubstantial use that may occur while on town time is fine, so long as it's not interfering with performance of the duties of the official or the employee.
I think identifying with what's the goal of the restriction, and if you can define what the goal is, what's going wrong, well, if you want to make sure that there's not a violation of an open meeting law or you're not public records law violating, I think defining what it is that you're protecting, especially by quoting law. In one of the examples, they said, don't share anything that would violate confidentiality or this or that. It's already mostly probably behavior that's defined by laws. And I know social media even, I think that's on the agenda for the Mass Municipal event this Saturday. I was interested in that, but it's also homecoming here, so.
I mean, the other thing about employees' personal use at work is if you're at work, you shouldn't be doing personal things. So we may need to, just state it. You're not supposed to do personal work while you're at work, except for those.
I mean, I asked tonight how bedtime went. So,
Yeah.
Maybe I shouldn't have, but I think we want to know what the goal is in having zero tolerance for something like that.
I think this is important enough that we shouldn't be talking in generalities. I think we should drill down and talk about each one of these specifically as it affects employees of the town that get paid to be employees of the town, what they say on behalf of the town, what they say on their own Facebook page or their own time. I think we should talk about what representatives of the town that are not employees but are employees by this definition, committees, both elected and appointed, maybe they're different, maybe they have different results, we'll have to see, probably in the consequence area or such. But I don't think we should be talking in generalities. I think this is important enough that we should be very specific about what is appropriate and what isn't. And I would venture to say that even if it's unenforceable, it should be a norm that we understand that it's inappropriate.
I think there's would be a value to split it out into three sections: employees, appointed, and elected. Mm-hmm. And some things are going to be the same all the way through, and other things are going to change. And I think there's a value to seeing those things that are different. And then, as you say, get down in there and say, as it says here, you don't have the ability to disclose any town-related information that's not already considered public information, unless it's considered public information somewhere else, that type of thing, but confidential information, privacy, other things like that. Just being very clear on that would be true in all three sections. We have an executive session to deal with a personnel issue. We can't disclose that until it becomes no longer an issue and it's a public thing, and even after that, it may not be public then. So we can give some of those examples.
The most important thing, part of this whole section to me, is the sentence right after that one. As representatives of the town of Lunenburg, employees should exercise caution with respect to comments they post concerning the town, its employees, or officials. I mean, we should be holding ourselves to a higher standard, not engaging in misinformation or fear-mongering or bullying or anything like that online. And we shouldn't be doing anything that could, portray your personal thoughts as the thoughts of the board.
Yeah, so giving suggested language, and this was one of the things in that workshop, which is that I am not speaking on behalf of the board, I'm speaking as an individual, and then you go and you say
Same as a
something.
meeting, like when I've gone to
Yeah.
planning board lately, I just
Yeah.
identify myself as speaking as a citizen, I'm not going to all these planning board meetings on marijuana as a selectman. Same with the social media.
And there are times when it's appropriate, and this is why elected officials get to do something slightly different sometimes, but even an individual who's an employee has the right to attack the Board of Selectmen or the planning board or anybody else for the decision they made because they disagree with it politically. And they may say something inflammatory, and that may not be the best way to say it, but that is public speech, the ability to have, the right of free speech. So,
But even that, I think, needs to be further defined. I mean, I think if the item you're talking about is under your jurisdiction, I think the only place you're allowed to talk about it is at this meeting in public.
no, not for elected officials.
I disagree. I really do.
So we took a vote, let's take an example. So we voted to change the, how to adopt a public street. We just took that vote.
Mhm.
And if it was a 4-1 vote and I was against it, I have the right to write a letter to the Fitchburg Sentinel to say that I disagree with the Board of Selectmen's position, and here's why. No different than doing that and putting that on Facebook.
I think it's very different. Because where are you going to put it on Facebook?
I may put it on my page, I may put it on another page discussing Lunenburg. I won't put it on the town's page because that's not the
All right,
appropriate-
but even discussing Lunenburg, now then you're deliberating in effect, or you're commenting on something that you...
Vote's already over. No more deliberation. It's not an open meeting law.
A vote's really ever over.
Yeah.
Yes, they're over when they're over.
No, I don't know. I think votes keep coming up all the time.
I also,
Then it becomes another issue because it's on the agenda again. But once it's not on the agenda, it's not an open meeting violation.
and to go with Bob, I think you really want to look at, there's city councilors that do a lot of communicating from
They're not
Fitchburg.
multiple member boards.
May I just finish?
No, because you've said this before and I haven't been able to comment because you've said it on social media. Okay? An elected official who's a senator or a congressman or a governor is a single person and they
Okay, I've
can
been
express their
interrupted.
opinions.
I've been interrupted and I want to finish my thought. I don't think of a
And
senator.
you just interrupted me back.
Well,
All right?
okay, I was interrupted first, so I would just like to finish my thought. I think of the value of communication and not wanting to restrict it completely, because I think when elected officials are put in a place, in general, people want to feel the ability to communicate. I think whether you can look at the rights and wrongs of it from a presidential point of view, from a governor, Charlie Baker, you can go down to senators, but senators are part of a collective body that gets together and votes. Congressmen are part, Benson and whatnot. They are individuals that get together as groups that vote. That's the same as us. We're individuals that get together as a group. This is our group. There's a group of senators, there's a group of congressmen. So they are indeed people who communicate as an elected official with individual opinions that get together to vote as groups very, very similar to what we are.
But they do
Are you
not
quite finished now? Could I speak? They are not the same. We are a member of a multiple member body. And if we're going to speak as selectmen, we speak as selectmen. I can't have an individual opinion as a selectman on something that the selectmen are going to vote on. I can have an opinion on it, but the place to share it is here, in my opinion. All right? It's different from a congressman or a senator because they speak for themselves. Yeah, they're one of 50 senators, but they don't speak as the Senate.
But they're not subject to the open meeting law. So the question I'd ask town council is that I believe that as a public official, I have the ability to speak on a topic in a public forum, and it doesn't count as deliberation. Now,
The matter before the board? In the
a matter, so for instance, So the position we're going to take on any of the zoning articles, we chose to wait to town meeting. So we have a public hearing coming up for the planning board in a couple of weeks. And I have the right to go there and say, I am for or against the moratorium. I have the right to say, I am going to vote at town meeting to recommend approval or disapproval. As an elected official, I have the right to say that in public. I don't have to wait till we get to a selectmen's meeting.
But I don't believe you have the right to say that on social media.
No different for social media.
Yes, it is, because the minute I respond, we're deliberating.
But then you don't respond to me. You can say, my opinion is.
But
You can write a letter to the Fitchburg Sentinel, so we can have 5 letters to the Fitchburg Sentinel, all debating whether we should be recommending something to town meeting. It's just
it's not
faster
deliberation.
for social media.
I think the scenario that you referenced is a public meeting of the town as well. It's different than an electronic communication like social media. And I believe they've identified electronic communications. If one member of a multiple member body expresses an opinion, even if no other members of that board have responded or to that email or electronic communication, that's still considered a violation of open meeting law.
So I would ask the question, is that case? Because I haven't heard of any rulings to that effect.
So that is the case for electronic communications like emails, that one-way communications of that sort can be deemed deliberation. The challenge with other sorts of social media is that some of that deliberation is occurring in public. So I don't think that there's a case on point that addresses, and I'll get a more definitive answer for you, a circumstance where you're utilizing a platform like Facebook or Twitter or something like that, where it is available to the public. I would agree generally that deliberation that could not occur, whether it be one-way communication or deliberation amongst the quorum of the board, cannot occur behind closed doors, can occur in a public forum. But it's something a little different when you're dealing with, again, a platform like Facebook or Twitter, because it falls somewhere in between the more traditional public forum and what is obviously off limits, which is something like an email communication that is not public.
But for example, maybe you can troubleshoot this for me. If Jamie goes on Facebook and says something about a topic that we've been discussing that I think is factually wrong, or I just disagree with it, and then the comment section just starts going, can I respond to him? I got to wait for people to go run that conversation, run rampant all week before I come back and bring it up here at a meeting to rebut what he said, to dispute a fact?
Well, that's the challenge, because the argument is that if you respond or you then chime in the comment section, that one could argue that that's deliberation, because you're discussing a matter that is within the jurisdiction and the purview of the board, and you're doing so outside of a board meeting, but you're also doing so in a public forum, right? But not with the board present.
If it is totally public. Now, a lot of Facebook sites are member-driven. They have moderators. The moderators determine what, or could determine what's there, what's not there, and who are members.
Well, that's the challenge. If I'm not friends with you or with you
That's
or
my
with you
point.
on Facebook, then I can't see that conversation, right?
If I can inject, it's the same outside of social media. If you remove social media, a couple of us could go out after and talk about a topic, and then, 2 people, 3 would be a violation, and then I could go have tea with a bunch of people and talk about the topic and infer my opinion of the topic. People are allowed to have opinions and freedom of speech and share and communicate. And I think as long as it's meeting laws like public record laws and open meeting laws, especially when you're talking about a private entity, a private site, I really don't know how government can start encroaching in as long as laws are being followed and determine whether or not people are allowed to communicate. I think it's a weird precedent to set.
But let's say you go to discussing Lunenburg, and I express my opinion on something we're going to deliberate on next week. Now, I have just silenced the 4 of you. You can't respond, because then it's deliberation. So it's inconsiderate of me
to say it to begin with.
Well, that's someone's private Facebook site, so I think it's important to define that that's not a town site. That is just somebody's private site that she successfully acquired a lot of members on, but it's her private site.
Well, but if
And we
I-
can't restrict her usage of Facebook.
If I go on there and say something, none of the rest of you can respond.
But I don't know
And-
if that's true or not, and that's where I'm asking town council to say whether, I believe I can go and say something. I
So
don't
you
believe-
can respond and then Jamie can respond? Aren't we deliberating?
I don't believe that I would be responding to her as opposed to responding to the topic.
See, I think that's too fine a line. You're in a conversation with a lot of people chiming in on what they think about a particular topic, and frankly, number one, I don't think it's the First Amendment discussion, and I don't think I'm looking for a law that says it's not appropriate. I'm looking for a policy that says we're above that. We should have our discussions here where we can have them in public, in front of whoever wants to come, on an agenda that they know we're going to talk about it. If it happens at 3 a.m. on a website, on a Facebook page that somebody is moderating, that half the town may or may not even know it's there, and the other half may live and die by it, to me, that's a standard that I don't believe is appropriate for us.
So what if I go to the Friendly Seniors and talk to them about what's going on, going back to when we were doing the schools? I think I have the right to say, we as the Board of Selectmen are going to take a position. I have the right to talk about what I'm going to vote. And I like this, I don't like this, other stuff like that. I have the ability to do that. Now, the question then becomes, somebody else shows up there, and I know we've always been very careful, but it is a semi-public meeting. I'm not going to always wait to come back here to talk.
The issue is the scale. You talking to a
It's the
couple,
speed, too.
the scale, yeah, the scale and the speed, and the sheer fact of the matter that the conversation quickly degrades. People don't hold themselves to the same standards they would as if they're in the same room with you.
So I'm going to get on the radio the way Dean Mazzarella gets on radio sometimes in Leominster, and he can talk about the various things, the new police station they're doing, the
Again, he's a mayor, he's not a multiple-member body.
city councilor Cormier could do it.
I think that would be wrong. They may do it, but I think it's wrong. I think we have to hold ourselves to a higher standard.
If it's a,
I give up a certain amount of my rights when I agree to serve the town as a selectman. I know I have rights, but I give them up because I agree to be a part of a multiple-member body.
I guess the question I have is that are we talking about any comment or the way we're commenting? Because I'm struggling with this, and I think this was in that MMA session is that the best thing to do is don't talk, but now you have, as soon as you're elected to the Board of Selectmen, you can't talk on public.
I don't.
That doesn't feel right either.
I don't. I stopped. I'm not on discussing Lunenburg. I don't comment on those things. I may like the town page things or share it to spread awareness, but I don't put my input in on Facebook anymore.
No, I don't either.
If someone wants to talk to me, they can come here to talk to me. If I want to talk to the people, I talk to them here. I don't seek other avenues.
Based on the time of night and the complexity of this, maybe we could get examples from other towns and really research them. I know Charter Review has done this with topics where it's really healthy to look at what other people are suggesting and brainstorm. Ours is obviously muddled and gray and needs work, and we might, it was at a Mass Municipal Association meeting where they're like, sometimes you just steal from someplace that has something good. I think maybe we just look for examples and see, because I feel like it's even just the two examples here, you can see things right away that have been defined better and more clearly than ours. Just looking at the time, we could sit here till 3 a.m. and have this discussion, and I don't think we're going to agree.
And I think the discussion is partly a policy discussion and partly a legal discussion. So there's a distinction, and one of you mentioned it, between what the law requires and what would constitute an open meeting law violation and what a policy should or shouldn't include. And you may differ and have different opinions on that. There's not a whole lot of case law that addresses social media. And by case law, I don't mean case law, I mean determinations from the Division of Open Government. Remember, email's been around for a while, and yet they just finally addressed email in the most recent recodification of the open meeting law, and now there's a handful of cases that address it. But there's not a lot out there. There's one case that I'm aware of that actually specifically makes reference to Facebook and posting in a comment section. And it wasn't on these exact facts. It was a scenario where there was no response by another member of the particular board. And so it was easy for the division to find that there was no violation. You start getting responses by members of the board or somebody chiming in. Is it just one person? Is it a quorum? There's no guidance in that regard. We just don't know.
If they like it.
If they like it, right.
I would like to know where the line is legally and for where the AG's offices think they're going to go. And then we then go to the policy. I think a blanket, you can't say anything, is going too far for me. I would like to have some specific guidelines for what would be the best practice if you didn't just not say anything at all, but what would be the next thing we talk about, how far we would actually be willing to say, all right, I'm not going to say that part, but maybe I have the ability to say this, I hope everybody comes to the next Selectmen's meeting to talk about such and such topic, because I have lots of feelings about it. That to me feels okay, as opposed to, I really don't like what we did with the BYOB policy because Section 8 was not the right policy. Getting down into a little bit more, but maybe that's not a bad way to educate the people too, so, I don't know. I'd like to get some examples.
You get real tricky, like I might want to post, like, I'm so excited about the big town tree lighting. Everybody should come and sing carol. Oh, Katie just talked about town on Facebook. So I feel like it's...
That's not what we're
No,
talking.
no, but when you make a policy, you may inadvertently cover that scenario. If you say Katie Adams can't talk about town on Facebook, you may inadvertently have a policy now that I bring these examples up just to be cautious, because you don't know the unintended consequence of a policy unless you do these hypotheticals and realize that you may be just attempting to make sure Katie Adams doesn't talk on Facebook. But if I have 4 children in town and everything I do is in town, how do you draw a line between no longer being able to talk about my town?
You can
So
talk
that-
about matters before the board.
It's just an example. I'm not trying to argue.
Yeah, but no, that would be the thing, is that we're not going to talk about pending matters as opposed to talking about matters we just voted on. Because that's the whole discussion we had as far as being respectful to each other about whether when we have a vote, we then all support it. Well, no, if it's a 4-1 vote or a 3-2 vote, that doesn't necessarily, it's the vote of the board, but doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to support it. Am I going to actively, do a revolution? No. But I think that this is a basic governmental discussion that would be helpful to actually get examples. That's that, you're going to have the town manager's evaluations coming up. I'm going to throw Heather under the bus right now. We shouldn't be on social media talking about what we think about what the town manager is doing.
I agree.
But if we have an agenda and somebody says something really outrageous in there, fair game to say, I think that was a really outrageous comment, without getting into the attacking Heather type of thing. So the question becomes, are we talking about the subject matter? Are we talking about how people are performing? I think we need to have some examples as we go through, and we even say, that's acceptable, that's not acceptable, and just let's talk about how we feel about it.
I don't think it's that complicated.
Freedom of speech is very complicated.
I think we shouldn't be discussing matters that are coming before the board on social media. Because again, if I say something, then I've silenced the other 4 people. They can't say anything because then it becomes deliberation. So it's disrespectful to say something about something that's coming before the board, in my opinion,
I
on
would agree
social
with that.
media.
I'll be interested and see how other towns are addressing it.
Well, I agree it's late, but I think this is probably one of the more important things we have to deal with. So if we have to make it the only agenda item one of these nights, I want to wrestle this to the ground because it's extremely frustrating.
I also wonder if we could get community input on what they're looking for in terms of our main goal of communication, and this is tied into communication, and their input may be useful.
I'm trying to get the 5 of us to agree on a norm so we can behave in an effective way for the town. I don't think I need Facebook to tell me how to do that.
I didn't say Facebook, I said community input.
So we could do it here then.
That's
Wouldn't that
what
be
I
interesting?
suggested. That's what I just suggested.
We could do everything here. We obviously have a disagreement on this one. And I'm willing to talk about disagreements, and I think that's a fine way to lay it out. If we agree on a position that the board has taken and say, here's the dissenting voices, here's this voice, here's why they said what they said, that's fine. But when something gets spun on Facebook and I don't have an ability to try to set that right, then I don't participate at all.
And I would ask town council to find out what are the limits for us to make changes on Facebook that do not amount to deliberation. Correcting facts.
That's not our, be a full-time job to do that.
Well, then we
It's
just.
not something we should have to do.
Well, then we just allow it to happen. If you're upset about something, you gotta deal with it.
Allowing it to happen is fine, but none of us five should be perpetuating it.
A lot of what we deal with, too, is opinion, just like the lady who got up and spoke about the concept of what is reasonable. Her feeling of what was reasonable was different than what a different speaker's perception of reasonable was, and people are allowed to share their opinions with the world, and I don't think we want to restrict people's ability to have freedom.
As long as it's not a matter before the board.
Everything's a matter before government in life.
So we're obviously
the
not
people.
going to agree at the moment, and I would propose that we end this discussion because we're not going to agree at the moment, no matter how we talk. So therefore, I think we need to get into some examples and see what we actually have common ground on.
I second
Because there are
that
going to be some
proposal.
things that are common ground, and there are other things that we're never going to agree on, and we need to know what those are.
All right. I think we asked the town council to be with us tonight to help with parts of this. I think that the issue is much bigger than that, because I think it has to do with norms and behaviors among the board as well. But to the extent that we can ask council he's heard what we said, he knows some of these issues, to give us some guidance and a place to start, that's fine. But I think this is a discussion we have to have as a board.
Yep.
I agree.
Okay. Anything else on policies before we wrap up?
There's no
Not for me.
policy on meeting length.
10:30.
I know the planning board has one.
So the answer is that you put time limits on various sections, and then you decide whether at that time when somebody's acting as a timekeeper, that you say we're now going to be over, and you either eliminate something from the agenda, or you vote to go further. But you're right, 10:30 is too late. It was an
Agreed.
important topic, but we probably should have started with social media.
Agreed.
Right after the special event
Still be
permit,
10:30 and we'd still be working.
which was equally lengthy.
All right. We have no more meetings in October. We definitely don't have a quorum for the 23rd. If we need to have a meeting on the 30th, we still can, but I don't believe we do, judging by, I think the warrant is in as good a shape as it's going to be in before town meeting. Our next regular meeting is November 6th. We are meeting with the school board on November 7th. The special town meeting is November 13th. Okay? Is there any public comment from the public? There's no public left. Any public comment from the board?
Sure. Just things I probably should have mentioned in the beginning. This weekend, Saturday is homecoming and the homecoming parade, and then Sunday is the Miles for Miles race. And then I keep seeing a sign, and I stopped and I should have read it more closely, but is there some sort of ham and bean supper at the Eagle House? And I don't have any details, but I know this weekend is jam-packed with good town events, so hopefully
Yes.
good weather.
Ham and bean supper at 4 p.m. at the Eagle House.
And that's Saturday,
Saturday.
I think.
Okay. Anything else?
Make a motion, we adjourn?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye. 10:30.
Thank you.